Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I know it sounds batshit. I'd think the same thing if I was reading this from your position. But the annals of history seldom lie. I'm not talking about biased reports and recollections. I mean cold, hard, factual history. The first time I heard it, I passed it off as being an annoying case of tinnitus, although I'd never experienced it before. The sound was faint and shrill, like an air raid siren infected with helium. Then, plants and vegetation in town began to die. Again, I didn't think much of it. After all, snow was due on the ground soon. It was natural progression for things to die and grow anew as the seasons change. It went away after a day or so. Either that, or I'd figured I'd somehow just gotten used to it. I remembered when my kids used to fuss as babies. It would drive my ex-wife absolutely crazy, to the point of tears sometimes. She'd scream at me, demanding to know how I was able to function so calmly with all the goddamned noise. I'd just kind of trained myself to tune it out. I don't mean that I'd ignore them completely, but babies are grunting, noisy little humans. If I went nuts over every little sound, I wouldn't survive. So that's the train of thought I was having the first time I heard the assaulting beacon of sound. After a week or so, I'd kind of forgotten about it. Then I heard it again. It sounded closer this time, near enough to grip my senses, but just out of reach for me to be able to pinpoint geographically. "Do you hear it? Can you hear what I hear?" I asked passers-by desperately, my voice half robbed by the whipping wind. I was sure I looked like a mess, my eyes wild with paranoia. "Towards the sky, past the trees?" Most shook their heads and looked at me incredulously. The rest ignored me completely. It still seemed like I was the only one who could hear anything out of the ordinary. Strangers, the ones not staring at me like I was off my nut, continued laughing and chatting as I stood there absolutely dumbfounded. All verbal articulation came to a halt the moment the fog rolled in, and I couldn't decide if the sudden atmospheric silence made things better or worse. The sirens still hammered into my mind like a dulled pickaxe. But anyway, the fog. Thick sheets of it billowed across the ground and sky, carrying with it a moisture and temperature I couldn't quite place. It almost felt like steam, but that didn't make sense. As much as I hated to drive through it, I had to. There was no sense in hanging around slack-jawed with the rest of them. Unintelligible murmurs, fat with uneducated guesses of its origin, already floated through the dense air. At that moment, anything would have been better to get sucked into than that. However, I didn't make it very far, but not for reasons that you would think. You see, the traffic on the bridge 2 miles from home was locked up solid. An exasperated sigh escaped my lips as I noticed people getting out of their cars and looking over the edge. What the hell happened now? I thought bitterly. Following suit, I put my Dodge in park and got out. It didn't take me long to see what they were all looking at, and suddenly the weather conditions made perfect sense. Poor birds. I'm sorry, guys. This is going to be sad, but the poor birds struggled to fly through the sky with bubbling feet. They propelled away from it the second they made contact, like it burned their skin. That was exactly what it looked like happened. Lifeless bodies of fish speckled the surface of the water as they rose to the top. It seemed like the previously almost frozen water was fucking boiling. There was no reason for the water to ever be hot, but especially not in the dead of December. Fellow drivers gasped in awe as tiny cyclones began to form offshore, almost too small to see. At least I knew I wasn't completely crazy. They may not have heard the siren, but they sure as hell experienced the effects it brought. I thanked God, the devil, and whoever else involved that it wasn't a warmer month. I couldn't imagine a swimmer being caught out in that. Eventually, the steam and traffic cleared, and I was able to make it home safely, if not sanely. Things moved on, as they do, and soon I was sure the day of the mass fish fry would be an event of the past. Something random with no connection to or implication of anything at all. Sometimes things like that happen, you know. Or maybe it was a fissure deep underground. That made sense as well. The next time it happened during the middle of the night, waking me up from a sound sleep. This time it was louder still, and my body shook with tremors of terror, with anticipation of what it might bring. My body sagged with relief a few hours later when it abated with no events. That is, until the sun rose and I opened my front door. Devastated bodies of birds and animals peppered my yard and street, at least a dozen or so. My neighbor across the street walked out to check her mail, almost screaming at the half-graveyard our lawns had become. "Did you hear it last night?" I asked her. She shook her head confusedly. "It sounded like an air raid siren around 2:15 a.m. You didn't hear it?" But it was too late. She'd already gone back inside. Fear began to grip my every waking thought. It felt like the world around me was slowly coming to an end, and I was the only one who had any warning about it. And no, I hadn't gone to the doctor about it. Who the hell would believe me? The one person I did mention it to passed it off as bariatric pressure or some shit like that. I sure as hell didn't understand it, so how did I expect anyone else to? The siren was becoming louder, closer, and more frequent. It was only the next morning that my thoughts grew fuzzy as my mind was crippled with a vague sense of dread. Hairs stood up all over my neck and body, like a reaction to static electricity. The siren was louder than ever this time, so loud that it made my vision blur at the corners. It was as if it was sounding in my very own living room, right next to my already throbbing head. I had to do something to get the pain to wane, long enough so that I could at least look outside or even call an ambulance if this thing really was some kind of physiological event. Improvisation had never been my strong suit, but I always tried to do the best I could with the clumsy faculties I was given. Without thinking, I grabbed my leg pillow and a roll of masking tape I'd kept on my dresser for painting. My stomach rolled as I was confronted with the fact that I hadn't washed the pillow in way too long, if ever. Weeks of ball, ass, and thigh sweat surrounded both sides of my face as I did my best to wrap it behind my head to cover my ears and tape it into place. I'm sure I looked like an asshole, but hell if I cared right then. I knew that I smelled like one, at least. But to my bittersweet relief, it helped enough for me to know that A, it wasn't just in my head, and B, I'd be able to stand up and walk to the window. The distant sound of a car crashing lay underneath the blaring noise for just a moment long enough for someone to lose their life. My mouth dropped open in shock as I saw my neighbor open up her front door. "Stop!" I cried out, not that she could have heard me. I hadn't even been able to hear myself. My fists pounded against the window in an attempt to get her attention. Whatever the hell this thing was, she needed to go back inside. It worked. Joy and relief, two feelings that had become foreign to me as of late, filled me for the first 5 seconds that our eyes met. She looked up at me, smiled and waved, completely oblivious to the blaring noise. However, that didn't matter. My attempts had worked. I would be able to help keep her safe. Then, the blood began to flow. Streaks of crimson ran from her nose, fell from the lower ledges of her eyelids, and trickled down from her bespectacled ears, turning the faux diamond earrings into rubies on their descent. I wouldn't say that her head exploded, per se, but that's sure as hell what it looked like by the time she crumpled to the ground. My temples became numb with foreboding, and I dove into my couch cushions in preparation. The ground seemed to vibrate as the wailing siren reached a cataclysmic crescendo. The glass of the windows tinkled as it shook, stretched to its breaking point with the pressure and pitch of sound. I knew they wouldn't hold for long. The thought occurred to me to move away from the living room window, but it was too late. I tensed as bits of glass peppered my body, the couch, and the floor. Then it just stopped. My body struggled to acclimate as the roaring volume gave way to deafening silence. Breaths came in panicked huffs and trembles as I rose to my feet, careful to avoid the shards of glass nestled in my bare carpet. I shook the rubble and debris from my slippers before placing them on my nicked feet and surveyed the damage to my home. I was sighing in relief that my bathroom mirror, window, and shower pane hadn't been affected when every cell froze in my body. A noise, not nearly as powerful as before, but just as alarming, resonated from the street in front of the house. I shuffled over to my front door as fast as my battered feet would carry me before throwing it open and peering outside. I couldn't believe my eyes, and what was left of my hearing was being quickly assaulted by squeals of maniacal giggles. Shock and terror filled me at what my eyes beheld. A baby, not more than 9 or 10 months old, sat naked in the middle of the broken street, as if every single event had led up to its arrival. He had thick curls of jet black hair that came to a distinct widow's peak in the apex of his forehead. The baby also had the darkest blue eyes I had ever seen. I'd have assumed they were brown or black, even if they weren't gleaming with joy. My mind reeled to think of where it could have come from and how it could have survived all of this. But what mostly bothered me, what unsettled me to my very core, was how it was laughing. Or, more so, what exactly was it laughing at?
I never thought that dying would save my life. But then, death has always been a funny son of a bitch. 3 weeks ago, I made an appointment to see my regular doctor about an annoying cough that wouldn't go away. Got so bad I swore that Gary, the guy who sat in the cubicle next to me at work, wanted to strangle me with my own phone cord. I didn't like him much either, so I considered us even. I walked into my doctor's office, figuring I'd gotten myself another case of bronchitis. I expected to walk out in 5 minutes with a prescription for the good cough medicine that makes me feel all warm and squishy as I drift off in front of the TV. She insisted on an X-ray, though, so I humored her, figuring I didn't have much choice if I wanted to walk out with that precious slip of paper. They say the quickest way to a man's heart is with radiation, I joked, and she laughed her way out of the room. But when she walked in a little later, with a developed X-ray in hand, she wasn't laughing. She popped the film sheet into the holding clips and flipped the light switch, revealing the black and white image of my lungs, specifically the gray cloud that had settled over them, like the weather at a doomed parade. I'm no trained professional, but the crowd of dark spots gathered in my lungs didn't look right to me. Non-small cell lung cancer is what it's called, though to me, non-small sounds like a nice way of saying big and scary. And yet they said I was lucky, that they caught it early enough to give me a fighting chance, so long as we took what they called an aggressive plan of attack. Let me tell you, I did not feel lucky. There isn't enough TV in the world to distract you from a diagnosis like that. Pretty soon your thoughts start to turn in on themselves. You analyze and reanalyze every choice and cringe-inducing mistake you've ever made. More than anything, my mind kept returning to all those times I'd lectured my parents about their pack-a-day smoking habit. I'd leave them informational flyers and email them links to support groups. It might be cool if you don't die, I tell them. Maybe stick around for a bit, just to see how it goes. I eventually gave up when I realized they were never going to change, and I was somehow becoming the bad guy for trying to keep my parents alive. Well, guess what? Those assholes retired to Florida with a clean bill of health, and they left me holding the check. Or, more accurately, the medical bill. We might have been blood, but it had slowly become bad blood. They were the reason I didn't carry a phone anymore, so I didn't have to live with the possibility of a surprise phone call. I didn't even bother calling to tell them about my diagnosis. Either I would do that when the treatments were over, to celebrate my victory over their second-hand gift to me, or my obituary would be the greatest I told you so in modern-day history. You can call it petty. I call it something to look forward to. When I signed in for my first chemo session, the girl who handed me the dictionary-sized stack of paperwork to fill out asked if I had someone to drive me home. I thought it was a pretty stupid question on account of us living in a city, where public transportation is always about 10 feet away. Seeing the look on my face, she explained that chemo takes a lot out of a person. I think that's the idea, I said. When she missed the obvious, and some would say brilliant, joke, and went to describe the feelings of nausea and exhaustion I might experience as a side effect of the treatment, I could see she wasn't going to let the subject go easily. Being that I was already experiencing nausea and exhaustion, I did the right thing and lied to her face. Don't worry, I said. An old friend will be waiting to pick me up. If it makes you feel any better, it wasn't a total lie. I consider the A-train to be a very old, very dear, very smelly, and very piss-stained friend. After filling out all that paperwork, I never wanted to use my arm again, which was right about the time a nurse brought me to the infusion room and told me we'd be using my arm for the treatment. My oncologist showed up, who I found to be a man who had never smiled in his life. He told me I'd be receiving my own personalized blend of chemo and pre-medications, including anti-nausea meds, anxiety meds, allergy meds, and steroids. I asked him if he could add a shot of whiskey to that cocktail, but the joke went over like a cardboard flamethrower. When the doctor, with the fantastic sense of humor, left, the nurse hooked me up to the poison drip and gave me a few tips about how I might feel. She said the steroids might give me energy, while the allergy and anti-anxiety drugs might make me sleepy. So an 8-ball, I said. When she gave me a confused look, I added, "Coke and heroin. The only way to party." "Hopefully it's not that strong," she said. And what about this stuff?" I asked, nodding to the clear liquid dripping into my bloodstream. "How will that make me feel?" "Usually not great, but it makes the cancer cells feel even worse." I could certainly agree with that kind of logic. "The enemy of my enemy," I said. And finally, she smiled. Then, she sat in a chair across the room and got busy, forgetting I existed. Nearly 5 hours later, I walked out of the oncology building feeling like I'd just gone on a weekend bender with Hunter Thompson and Satan's pharmacist. The sun had gone down and the city's more colorful citizens were starting to crawl out of their caves. I felt like I was swimming in slow motion through a crowd of grinning, talking fish, and they were all trying to sell me something. I had the vague thought that there was someone I was supposed to meet, until about 3 blocks later when I remembered that it was a lie I told that nosy woman at the front desk to get her off my back. By the time I reached the stairs leading down to the subway, my head felt like an overinflated balloon about to float up into the sky, leaving behind sad children and crying hippies concerned for the dolphins that would choke on me. The light glittered up at me from the subway like a flashlight dropped in the ocean, and I followed it down into the cold, dark ground. I didn't have to wait long for the next train, which was good because the benches were looking way too comfortable to risk sitting on them and falling asleep. When a dirty subway bench starts looking like a king-sized bed, you know you're in trouble. The A train was crowded, but luckily not packed too tight with people. Most of them were probably heading to a game or a concert or, well, whatever it is normal people did for fun. It was only by some miracle that I found an empty seat. My breath must have stunk like radioactive rat's ass because the woman in the seat next to me turned away and gave me a nice look at the back of her neck. She pretended like I wasn't there, which, to be fair, was pretty much true. I wasn't all there. Not really. My brain felt like old jelly, and my veins burned like a gasoline fire. As the automatic doors closed and the train squeaked out of the station, I could feel my head being pulled toward the floor. The invisible cowboy called Sleep had roped my neck and was swiftly taking me down, tying my hands and feet together to leave me helpless. The last thing I heard was a tinny-sounding announcement about a delay due to construction on the tracks. I distantly remembered something about a big, expensive project to dig a new tunnel and add extra subway lines, but I could barely think over the thumping of the tracks beneath us. The rhythmic sound grew slower and heavier, and my eyes did the same. They were impossibly heavy, unable to stay open. My head swirled with chemicals and the muffled sounds of voices drifting away to nothing as I fell and fell through the darkness. In my dreams, I was sitting in a cubicle, surrounded by shadows. My arms, both of them, were hooked up to tubes, long tubes that ran high above my head and into the shadows. Inside the tubes was what looked like tiny black ants, a parade of them marching into my veins, making my arms itch and burn. So many ants. They moved like liquid, like oil sludge through an engine. I tried to pull the tubes from my arms, but they wouldn't budge, like they were soldered to my flesh, a permanent part of me. I looked up to see the bags they were attached to, where the ants were coming from, the origin of their death march. Instead of IV bags, I saw 2 bodies dangling above me in the dark. The tubes ran from their arms to mine, their faces just barely visible. It was Mom and Dad, smiling down at me, squeezing their arms to make the ants march faster, laughing as they fed me the blackness that lived inside of them. Before my eyes were open, I knew something was wrong. Usually falling asleep on the subway meant missing a stop, Life had continued on without you, and it was on you to shake off the sleep and catch up. But this time, it was all wrong. This time, something had changed. Not only had someone turned the volume down, they changed the channel entirely, tuned into a different frequency on another wavelength. The scattered voices of the A-train crowd had fallen silent, replaced by the strange, overbearing echo of the steel cars moving through the tunnel, tick, 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 ticking like a drawn-out time bomb. My eyelids opened like two forgotten sarcophagi, dry and scratchy as the ancient desert. I was staring down at my own shirt, my neck bent at a sharp angle. As I picked my head up, pain shot through my shoulders and neck. The muscles sore from so much time spent hunched over. I would have cursed or cried out, but my throat was even drier than my eyes, and no sound came out when I tried. Blinking, trying to focus, I looked around at the train car, attempting to make sense of what I saw. The train's overhead lights had gone out, leaving the car to be lit only by a single strip of yellow emergency lights. Much stronger were the lights coming to the windows from the subway tunnel. They strobed past, illuminating the inside of the car from front to back. A slow, steady pattern, like we were being scanned by an alien ship. But the really strange thing, the thing that made me blink the sleep from my eyes and fight the pounding in my temple, was what those lights lit up. The train car appeared to be transporting not commuters, but corpses. A few dozen dead bodies, sitting upright in their seats, rocking back and forth from the movement of the train. Light flickered slowly past them from the tunnel outside, playing across their slumped, unmoving forms. I watched the bodies sway in the strobe light, feeling the moments stretch on and on. Just me, and a train car full of dead bodies, moving through the earth like a serpent in the night. It had to be a dream. It was too surreal, too bizarre to be real life. I glanced up, expecting to see my parents still strung up by tubes, but saw only the ceiling of the train car, illuminated by passing lights. On weak, sleep-heavy legs I stood, needing more than anything to know what was going on, to know what frequency I'd woken up in. I don't know if it was the cocktail of chemicals swimming in my veins or the adrenaline rush of fear, but my legs shook like a newborn deer, learning to walk. I stared at the dark train car, silently begging, praying for someone to move and break the spell. Only the rocking of the train moved the bodies, swayed them in their seats, the faint sound of their clothes shifting against the metal and plastic benches. For some reason, it hadn't occurred to me until just then that I'd been sitting next to someone when I fell asleep. The woman who pretended I didn't exist. I was starting to think she was right, that I was a ghost, drifting through the afterlife. Which was crazy, of course, but then so was what I'd woken up to. I looked back at the seat next to mine and found her exactly where I'd left her. Her head was slumped over, like the others, and she looked just as dead as them, her head swaying to the rhythmic rocking of the train. But she wasn't exactly as I'd left her. There was something different. Something new about her. The neck she'd shown me when I sat down had something sticking out of it, almost like a large pyramid at the base of her skull. It was thick and short, and it came to a sharp point. Careful not to disturb her, I steadied myself against the swaying of the train and leaned in for a better look. It looked like an arrowhead erupting from the nape of her neck, complete with a dribble of dried blood at the entry point. As I got closer, I made out tiny rows of barbs. Just when I thought the woman had the oddest piercing I'd ever seen, the thing on her neck did something I really wish it hadn't done. It moved. Like the tail of a rat settling into its nest, the thing on her neck shifted and buried in deeper. My dry throat found its voice again as I nearly fell back, letting out a small guttural cry. The woman's slumped head shifted in what at first I thought was the movement of the train, taking a sharp curve in the tunnel. But then it moved again, this time rising up, the neck craning, the head turning toward the sound I'd made like a sluggish dog alerted to trouble. If I thought the barbed tail moving in her neck was shocking, it was nothing compared to the sight of the woman's eyes. Her eyelids rose like curtains at the world's worst play, revealing 2 white orbs. The centers were barely discolored by what used to be her corneas. In the passing lights of the subway tunnel, I saw no recognition, no reaction to the light. The woman, if she was even aware of me, couldn't see me, couldn't make out my horrified expression staring back at her, no matter how much she craned her neck and aimed her dead, milky eyes at me, her mouth slack, and her features as barren as the surface of a cold moon. The way her head tilted reminded me of a puppet, as if not moving by choice, but by something working it from inside. With a hard realization dawning on me, I turned away from the white-eyed woman and looked at the next closest person to me. A young guy in a hoodie rocked in his seat, arms limp at his side, head slumped over. Inching closer to peek over his hood, I made out the already familiar shape on the back of his neck. A barbed tail, surrounded by dried blood. The girl next to him, wearing hoop earrings and a fake fur coat, had the same on her neck. I looked around the darkened train car, still slipping through the tunnels, lights passing in rhythm like the beat of a funeral dirge. And in that moment, alone among the bobbing, half-dead commuters of a train that didn't appear to be stopping, I finally realized the inarguable truth of what I'd woken up to. I'm dead. At the sound of my voice, little more than a whisper, the slumped head of every person in the train car shot up. I froze in place as 100 heads holding 200 white eyes scanned the dark, ears tilted, trying to locate the source of the sound. Their movements were exactly like the woman's, the moves of a puppet. Suddenly, I felt like I was going to piss my pants. I held it, though. Held my piss and held my breath as the slack-jawed crowd with the tails in their necks scanned the train car from their seats for whatever didn't belong, whatever wasn't one of them. What they would do if they found it, if they found me, was not something I wanted to find out. At that point, I realized I had 2 options. The train didn't appear to be making any stops, and it was only a matter of time until the blind, infected, whatever they were, people in the train caught me standing in their midst. My first option was to sit back down in my seat and wait it out. Wait until the train stopped on its own, or someone shut it down. There was no telling how long that would take, though, and by that time I would probably piss myself and get sniffed out by the white-eyed creeps. The other option was to shut it down myself. There was no way of knowing what had happened to the train conductor, but considering we'd blown past the last few stops without signs of slowing down, it was safe to assume they either knew what was happening and wanted no part of it, or they'd been taken over as well. Either way, it meant making my way up to the conductor's car, getting inside, and somehow convincing the conductor to stop the train. whether that meant by words or by force. I didn't know. One more glance at the woman I'd slept next to was all I needed to make up my mind. There was no way I was going to sit next to her and calmly wait for a miracle to save me, not with that unblinking, silently drooling look on her deadened face. I'd rather sit next to a crying baby on a flight from New York to Singapore. My only consolation was that I'd sat at the front of the train, and so only had to cross one car to reach the conductor. With the slowest, quietest footsteps I'd ever taken in my life, I made the excruciating trek from the back of the car to the front, holding the poles to keep me steady when I could, every inch of the way staring at the white, unblinking eyes around me, watching for the slightest hint of recognition. When I passed someone standing, their stiffened arms hooked around the poles, I moved around them at the pace of a glacier. By the time I reached the door at the front of the car, my legs were sore from staying so tense, and they'd already been tired from the personalized poison cocktail swimming through them. With the sliding door finally in front of me, I knew I'd reached a crucial moment. Do or die, if you will. After spending so much time being as silent as possible, I was about to break that silence very abruptly. There was no slow, quiet way to do it. Once the door was even slightly open, the wind from the moving train would rush in, and there was no way of knowing how the puppets were going to react to it. Not well, if I had to guess, but there was no going back. There was no other way. With my tense fingers wrapped around the cold handle, my body like a coiled spring, I wrenched the sliding door open and at the same time flung myself to the open space, the wind hitting me like a full body punch, then spun and wrenched the door shut again, holding the handle in case anyone tried to pull it open. Wind buffeted my body, my clothes flapping like a flag in a storm as the two cars bumped and swayed together. A small chain on either side was all that kept me from tumbling off the train and into the dark tunnel. Through the door's window, I watched the car I'd just escaped from come to life, like the world's worst puppet show. Passengers lurched to their crooked feet and stumbled blindly toward the door, bumping and fumbling past each other to find the noise they'd just heard. I held on tight to the handle, relieved to see none of them try to open it, not with any conviction. A few of them reached out and slapped at the door, making movements that resembled a functioning human, or maybe a dog trying to recreate something it had done accidentally. But luckily for me, it wasn't coordinated enough to actually open the heavy door. Their blind eyes stared out the window, nothing separating us but a half-inch of glass and a world of understanding. These weren't human faces in front of me. There was something alien, filtered through a layer of human bone and muscle. I'd walked among them, tempting death with each footstep. But now came the hard part. I could see him in there, through the thick, dirty glass of the final door. I watched as the train conductor sat perfectly still in his seat, his hand resting on a large button on the console. Since he was wearing a windbreaker with a collar pulled up, I couldn't get a look at his neck to see what might be hiding there, but the eeriness of his posture, the crooked way he sat in the chair with his foot on the pedal, didn't give me much hope. After about half a minute, as I gathered my courage from the wind, the button under the conductor's hand started to flash. It looked like some kind of alert, but I had no idea how trains operated, so it was only a guess. After another 30 seconds passed and he hadn't pressed the button, assumedly because he couldn't see it, it began to buzz sharply, so loud I could hear it over the wind and the clatter of the train. The moment the noise started, the conductor slapped at the button, shutting off both the noise and the light at once. Just like that, I understood what I was looking at. It was some kind of dead man's switch, designed to make sure the conductor was still both alive and awake to turn it off in the event of an emergency. Apparently, he was both alive and awake, but probably not the way the designers had planned. His mindless reaction to the stimuli was what kept the train going. It was a repeating pattern. Things make noise. Hit thing until it stops making noise. Repeat. To be honest, it didn't look much different from the way I looked at work, which hit a little too close to home for me. If that thought bothered me, it was nothing compared to the realization that I was standing on a train, between moving cars no less, that was being operated by a blind man, himself operated by some kind of parasite that had dug itself into his brain. It was only a matter of time before we ran into trouble, be it a stopped train or some other blockage the conductor would have no skills to see, much less avoid. With a look around for something, anything I could use as a weapon, and coming up with a big, fat nothing, I gripped the handle of the conductor's car, took a breath, prayed silently to every god I'd ever heard of and a few I hadn't, and flung open the door. The conductor turned to face me with a slackened face and two milky white eyes that looked right through me. He was a large man, with pockmarked skin and a graying beard. He rose from the seat like his shoulders had ropes attached to them, a bad performance of Peter Pan with two uncoordinated stagehands just out of view working the pulley system. I had the bright idea that maybe he could be reasoned with, that whatever was controlling him might understand the words taken in by the ears of its host. I figured it was worth a shot, trying to reason with him, at least for the sake of my own conscience. With only a second or two to spare, I thought of the most diplomatic thing I could come up with on such short notice. "Sit down. I don't want to kill you." It certainly wasn't my best work. I paused for a moment to see how my extended olive branch would be received. To my surprise, the conductor paused as well. He cocked his head like a dog hearing the peanut butter jar, and opened his mouth. Except that wasn't right. It wasn't that he opened his mouth, but rather his mouth was opened for him. I waited to hear what he had to say in return. The first words exchanged between two different species since, well, maybe ever. It might just turn out to be a historic occasion. Potential planetary war avoided by two individuals, breaking down the walls of communication. Except that's not what happened. Instead of words, a noise rose up from inside his throat, like the droning song of a cicada during a hot summer. I watched in disgust as two thick antennae pushed past the conductor's tongue and lips, feeling the air around it. I thought it was part of the thing that was controlling him, conducting the conductor, so to speak, until it managed to crawl all the way out of his mouth, tail and all. It was a totally separate creature from the one in his neck. How many of those things were inside him? And more importantly, was I going to throw up on myself? It was long, nearly a foot from end to end, with a sectional body like a blackish pink worm, and a spiked tail that wrapped around the conductor's neck. It made its way onto his shoulder with surprising speed, wet with saliva and fast as hell. The face, if you could call it that, was little more than an eyeless suction cup lined with rows of needle-like teeth that glistened as they shifted. As the creature tested the air with its twitching antennae, its long body tensed and coiled. I had already decided what thought needed to be communicated between our two species next. "You are one nasty little bastard," I said. And that's when it jumped at me. The thing sprung off the conductor's shoulder, aimed right for my face, its wormy mouth open and teeth rotating. I barely had time to move. Purely by instinct, my hand shot up in front of my face, blocking it from being hit. Instead, the creature wrapped around my wrist and squeezed tight, like a boa constrictor with a mouse in its grip. Its antennae twitched wildly, tail whipping at my arms. It struggled to reach my face. I felt its needle teeth clamp down on my exposed wrist. My nerves lit up as it bit down hard, teeth digging in. I screamed, tried to smash it against the train wall. I was desperate to get it off me, but it moved, making me slam my own injured arm into the wall. I screamed again. It pulled its suction cup mouth from my arm and hissed like a cockroach, its tiny teeth wet with my blood. I tried to shout back at it, tell it to crawl up its own ass, but it went again for my face. Served me right. Now wasn't the time for witty comebacks. I did everything I could to shake it off, smash it against something, but it was too fast, too slippery. Suddenly, I remembered the conductor was still there, and I turned to find his puppet hands reaching out toward me. He wanted to restrain me, to help the creature that had just crawled out of his mouth do its job. I raised my fist to punch him right in his creepy beard, realizing too late it was the arm that currently had a demonic worm wrapped around it. I'd screwed up, exposing my face to the slimy beast to do God knew what. But just when I thought it was over, just when I thought I was the next puppet in the world's nastiest children's show, something funny happened. The creature on my arm seized up, its long body going so tense and cut off the circulation to my hand. I felt waves of peristalsis pulse through its form. A sound almost like a wet cough came from its needled mouth, and as I watched it twist and convulse around my arm, I noticed even the conductor seemed to be listening to the sick sounds it made. The creature's skin shifted to a gray pallor. Then, its group loosened, no longer restricting my blood flow. Whatever it was doing, I didn't want to find out. I reached out, grabbed it around the middle, and squeezed as hard as I could. It squished and popped between my fingers like a rotten tomato. Once it had completely stopped squirming, I dropped it. It fell to the floor with 2 soft thumps, one for each half. I stared down at it in disbelief, ignoring the smell of my newly painted hand. I looked up at the conductor, expecting him to lash out at me, to demand revenge for whatever the hell had just happened to his tenant. But the large button, which must have been flashing while I'd fought the creature on my arm, began to buzz for attention. He cocked his head, listening blindly to the noise, then fumbled back into his seat as if I was no longer there. He slapped the button to make it stop buzzing, back at work like nothing had happened. But he was too late. The emergency brakes engaged, nearly throwing us both to the floor. With a long, dry screech of metal, the train came to a stop in the dark tunnel. I breathed a hesitant sigh of relief. We were no longer in danger of smashing into something up ahead. But being that we were sitting dead on the tracks, the risk was now that another train would smash into us. Not exactly a big difference results-wise. I stepped over the dead worm thing while keeping a close eye on the blind conductor. Without a button to press, he'd become just as useless as all his blind passengers behind us. Mounted under the console was a heavy tin box with first aid equipment inside. I used it to smash in the conductor's head, starting with the tail and the back of his neck. He didn't scream. The creature did enough of that for the 2 of them. After taking care of the conductor and his passenger, I opened the dented metal box and used one of the bandages inside to wipe the slime off my hands, the other to wrap my bleeding arm. Then, I found a heavy flashlight that worked well and felt solid in my hand. I checked in on the train passengers through the window. They returned to their seats and were once again sitting blind and half dead, as if awaiting instructions. What those instructions would be, I didn't know. I didn't want to know. There was only one thing I did know. I needed to get off that train and find my way out. Maybe warn people about what I'd seen down there. But that was a very distant second, if there was time. I climbed down between the train cars, nearly falling off in the process. My clothes got dirty with oil and grease, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was leaving the train of the damned behind and getting above ground. At that point, I noticed something interesting. The big bite wound in my arm wasn't bothering me at all. I studied the bandage under the beam of the flashlight and found the blood had already stopped flowing. Even though the skin around it was red and inflamed, it didn't hurt at all. In fact, it was almost numb to the touch. It made me think of mosquitoes and how their saliva works like an anesthetic so we don't feel them working on us. From what I recalled, they even inject us with anticoagulants to keep the blood flowing. Could these things do something similar? Numb us up, but heal the entry wound instead to preserve the host? I didn't want to think about that either. Not until I got the hell out of hell. With the flashlight in hand, I looked both ways down the tunnel, where we'd come from and where we were going. They both looked equally unpromising. I decided to move forward, telling myself it was a sign of optimism or some bullshit. The truth was, I didn't want to walk along the train and past all those windows to catch even one glimpse of all the lifeless puppets in there. Just the thought of it sent a chill up my tired back. The tunnel lights were a lot further apart than I remembered. Where before they'd passed by in a steady, hypnotic pattern to light up the train car of seemingly dead bodies, on foot they were a few minutes apart, meaning I spent more time in the dark than I did the light. The flashlight helped, though even combined, the lights weren't enough to beat back the shadows of that cold, dead place. Dirt and small rocks crunched under my dragging feet, echoing off the walls. It felt like an eternity down there in the dark. Emptiness behind, infinity ahead. But the real problem was, I wasn't alone in those tunnels. Living in the city, you get used to the sounds of rodents and insects, the scratching of rats, the pitter-patter of roaches searching for food. You don't like it, of course, but you kind of accept the inevitability of dirty things in your life. They could be kept at bay for a little while, killed and contained and kept away from your food, but eventually, they always find their way back in. Except what I was hearing wasn't rats, and it wasn't roaches either. All around me, coming from the shadows and off the walls, was the shuffle of rocks and dirt. Invisible things, sliding through the darkness, crawling and slipping along the ground and over the train tracks. I knew exactly what they were looking for, and I considered turning off the flashlight to make sure they didn't find it. Then, I remembered it didn't matter anyway. They were blind as bats. More so, since they were actually blind, it probably didn't matter if I kept the flashlight on, just that I not make any noise. I decided to keep it on so I could see better and not trip in the dark, thus making noise and attracting attention. Still, I didn't aim it directly down at the ground. There was no point in pushing it, and I really didn't want to see the ground moving around my feet. After what must have been 8 or 9 years, or 20 minutes, depending on how you do the math, I found a door. It was unlocked, thankfully, and it led to a maintenance area that looked like it hadn't been used in over a decade. It was a large room, carpeted in dust and rat droppings, without a single light bulb to light it up. I didn't know what a damned thing in it was used for, other than a few broken-down generators and an old mop, but I wasn't planning on sticking around to find out. I hurried through the stale-smelling place, through another door, and up a stairwell thick with cobwebs and cigarette butts, tripping over my own feet the entire way. After a few turns and another door, I found myself ejected unceremoniously into a subway station I'd never been in before. It really didn't matter, so long as it got me that much closer to ground level. Though, as I weaved my way across the platform and up another flight of stairs, I noticed that the station was completely empty. Not even a ticket booth was occupied. The sight was troubling, but at that moment, I cared only about getting to the surface, about reaching the air and the light, and God help me, even the people My legs were tired and my heart pounded and my lungs felt like they would burst. But I charged up those final steps faster than I'd ever run before, like an overdue baby, ready to be born. Finally, I was free, above ground and out of the grave. The night air felt cool and refreshing on my hot, sweaty skin, and even the city's smoggy air was an improvement on what I'd been breathing. I gave myself a few seconds to enjoy the victory and take in the feeling. I'd made it. I'd looked death in its eyeless, suction-cupped face and lived to talk about it. When the novelty of being alive wore off, which took all of 10 seconds, I spotted a police officer standing near an intersection. The traffic was at a standstill, and my guess was she was there to direct it. Seeing a real live authority figure, the responsibility of warning someone about what I'd seen hit me like it hadn't before. People needed to know what was going on, to stop it from spreading. And if I was going to be the selfless hero to do it, recognized for the rest of my life as the man who saved them all, then all the better. "Officer!" I shouted as I ran up to her. "Down there! The subway! They need help! Creatures! Horrible things!" My words were a mess, coming out a few at a time and mostly out of order. But as she turned to face me, to look not at me, but through me, with those clouded over eyes and that blank expression, I knew my words didn't matter. None of it mattered, because no one cared. Not the officer in front of me, not the people standing blindly around us, not even the drivers in all the cars stopped all along the street as far as I could see. The city was eerily quiet, yet still full of people. But to call them people was an exaggeration. They were puppets. A city of puppets standing around waiting for their strings to be pulled. The only sounds I heard were the idling of car engines and the useless changing of traffic signals. That, and the crawling, the shuffling and slithering of legless things in the alleys and under the ground. I backed away from the police officer before she could open her mouth and birth the inevitable. When I found a somewhat secluded place in a small park, away from all the wide-eyed, slack-faced puppets, I sat down on a bench and buried my face in my hands. Was I the only one not taken by those things? And if so, should I feel lucky about it? Or somehow offended? Was I actually beneath the standards of blind, brain-sucking worms? As I sat on the bench contemplating what to do next, where to go or who to call, I rubbed my aching neck. Between the chemo cocktail and my adventure down below, which included the cardio-heavy act of beating a man to death, I was tired to my bones. My fingers touched something on my neck. I jumped up from the bench, panic coursing through me, and slapped and clawed at the back of my head to pull whatever it was loose. I would die before I let one of those things turn me into a puppet. No way was I letting them win. Not after all I'd gone through. But nothing came. There was no tail, no creature. I looked at my hand and found it stained with dried blood. Touching my neck again, carefully, I felt a large wound there, all caked with scabs and coagulated blood, and only a faint stinging to go with it, more from my clumsy slapping and clawing than anything. It didn't make sense. But then I thought of the anesthetic in the mosquito saliva, the coagulant, and I thought of what happened to the conductor's car when the creature bit my arm. It was almost like an allergic reaction I'd witnessed, a violent response to something foreign and dangerous, a reaction to my blood, to the chemical cocktail floating in my veins, The chemo had turned my blood toxic. Not just a bad taste, but a dangerous one. Those 4 hours under the needle had been like being fitted for armor. A radioactive shield, protecting me from the tiny, vile dragons of the world. The enemy of my enemy. As I stood there, trying to understand how dying had saved my life, how the monster inside me had protected me from the ones outside, I became aware of footsteps on the sidewalk nearby. They were normal footsteps, not the shuffling of puppet feet, and as I stood silently in the small park, I watched a hooded figure walk past. She was fairly tall, a young woman in a purple hoodie, and when she turned to casually glance at me without stopping, I saw beneath her hood. She had no hair, only eyebrows, and a hard stare that said she'd been to hell and back. She was gorgeous in a princess warrior kind of way. With those gray eyes, she'd stared down the same death as me, taken the same poisons, killing herself to live. After we locked eyes for one intense moment, she simply nodded, then kept walking until she disappeared around a corner. 2 ships, passing in the night. I took a deep breath, filling up my diseased lungs with night air, inflating those twin monsters inside me. Monsters locked away in a rib cage. Then, I found a phone and dialed a number I hadn't dialed in years, watching the puppets walk blindly past. Fake lives, with fake meaning. My father picked up, though it was on speakerphone as usual. My mother was in the room too. They both started talking at once, asking about the things they were hearing about on the news. I cut them off, stopping them from talking over each other, and told them to listen to me very carefully. Oh, there's good news, and there's bad news, I explained to them. The good news is, I have cancer. The bad news is, you don't. I hung up before they could say another word. Then, I went off to find the Princess Warrior. It was time to start a new tribe. A poisonous tribe. One free of strings.
There's one hard and fast rule about me. If there's a new chick at school and she's hot, she's mine. It's not a matter of if I'm making it all the way with her. It's a matter of when. And no, I don't mean getting in her pants. I mean getting her facing my pants. Because Mickey Banks is a god, and the only prayers I'll accept are the ones spoken directly into my skin mic. And I don't let nobody stop praying until there's some major feedback from my Marshall stack. I mean, look at me. This hair, this body, these eyes. You belong on your knees if you want some of this. Okay, that's what I used to think. There's a fine line between being humbled and being humiliated, and I'm still not sure which camp I landed in. So this preacher with this helmet hair and salesman teeth moved into our little burg. He brought with him a daughter that couldn't have been more perfect. Something told me that sweet peach had never had a worm inside it. I was gonna change that. I knew my chances were good, because whenever I passed her in the hall, her eyes went from my face to my jeans and back to my face. Real shy-like. She was as good as mine. But I knew that you can't just take on a preacher's daughter like you take on your average hoe. I had to pretend that I actually liked her, like I wanted to know more about her than what the top of her head looked like. Her name was Olivia, and she was more than happy to hear what I had in mind. I should have questioned how easily I got in, but I was a bull, and I charged straight for that red flag instead of stopping to think about it. She had me over on a weekend when her parents would be away longer than usual due to some Sunday special tent worship extravaganza thing. She pretended to be sick, so they left home. Oh man, I don't know if it was her retainer plate or just talent, but I was seeing stars. I was a believer for just a few seconds, but then I remembered that I don't want to be punished for what I was doing, so back to atheism I went. When I could see straight again, I looked around for the mess. There wasn't any. Her lips looked real tight for a second before she smiled and winked. I got rid of the evidence. Now that, my friend, was one hell of a girl. She was probably the girl of my dreams. I didn't know it at the time. I did what I always did, chased after another one, and I made sure that Olivia saw it. It crushed her, to put it lightly. I didn't feel any shame. It kind of made the next gobbling really nice. I wasn't a good guy. I lay in bed with Bella, the one right after Olivia. I'd have to get home before my parents raised a storm, but I took the time to marinate in the good time I just had. I heard this siren go off outside. It was like some old school air raid siren. And before I could think about it, it started to get hard again. That freaking hurt. I didn't know why it was happening, so I was scared on top of being too tender. It was probably the worst pain I had ever felt, because I passed out. I didn't wake up until morning. Bella was smiling at me, but looked worried. "You were crying in your sleep," she said. "No, I wasn't." "Yes, you were. It woke me up." "You were dreaming. I don't cry." She looked like she was ready to argue until her eyes suddenly got big. "Oh shoot, you need to leave before my parents see you." Ugh. That meant that I'd be facing my parents for sure. But at least I had a chance to avoid double confrontation. Some other chick busted through the door. She was probably 14 and she was straight up ugly. She looked at me and looked at Bella. "All right, Belle, give me money if you don't want me to tell Mom and Dad again." Dang, that little girl had hustle. Bella began fishing for cash from a drawer when I heard that weird siren again. I looked at little girl like I was waiting for her to react to the moaning wail, but she just threw me an expression like, "What?" My manhood did exactly what it did last night. I got rock hard so fast that it hurt. I was still in my boxers, so the tent I was pitching was plain to see. Little girl's eyes went boing, and she covered her mouth. I guess that was self-defense. I turned and saw Bella, and her face had turned as red as an apple. "Really? After all that, you're gonna creep on my kid sister?" Every object near her began flying in my face. I decided to get dressed instead of negotiate. My pants were halfway up when Bella picked up like the 15th thing to throw at me, and then held back. It was pepper spray. She sprayed me in the face. I howled. She sprayed me in the crotch. I howled more. She sprayed me in the face again. I had to leave. Survival instincts threw me into autopilot. If there was ever a man that could run a marathon with his pants around his ankles, it was me in that moment. I don't even remember how I got out of the house. I just remember hearing cars honking and feeling my bare feet smacking pavement as I screamed at the top of my lungs. My pants must have fallen off at some point because I was taking full strides. My tears cleared the vision in my left eye just enough for me to see a red-tinted world full of cars swerving around me. Between breaths, I heard a kid ask, "Mommy, is Daddy that big?" before I started screaming again. I couldn't run in a straight line. I went into someone's yard where a couple of little girls were having a tea party with a ginormous St. Bernard. I crashed into the table like a purple-horned rhino. An open jar of peanut butter flipped in a perfect arc before impaling itself between my legs. Above the yelps of the little girls, I could hear the St. Bernard pounding the ground, chasing me. He was either gonna maul me or get him some peanut butter. Either outcome was bad. The last thing I remember, I was running over a crosswalk where an old woman stood leaning on her walker. "How did you know I love peanut butter?" she squawked. That's when I hit the telephone pole beside her. I woke up in the hospital. My eyes didn't burn, my balls didn't burn, but Jesus H. Christ did my man bits feel raw. The first thing I saw was the television rolling the news. The camera zoomed in on a St. Bernard that had peanut butter smeared all over its face. Then the TV clicked off and I sensed the presence of others. My parents were in the room. Mom had several facial expressions fighting for dominance, so she was googly-eyed like a chameleon. Dad was just beyond expression. So my hospital room became an interrogation chamber. Once every last bit of information had been spilled, I was grounded and banned from ever getting a dog. And another thing, I couldn't come and go to school anymore on my own. Dad drove me, which was beyond humiliating. Relatively. 3 weeks into my grounding, the siren sound woke me from a dead sleep. It was 3 a.m., and the sound made my peanut butter peg swell into a nutrageous. I cried out in pain. I'm no doctor, but when you pop a boner like a car deploying an airbag, something ain't right. I was moaning like dogs do when they hear sirens. The weird noise was loud enough to shatter my teeth that time. I made the mistake of looking out the window. Now, I don't know if I was dreaming or not, but what I saw would have killed any sane man's heart on, so I must not have been sane. The thing's face was like a jack-o'-lantern, with the flesh of an old man instead of a pumpkin. The eyes were vacant and yet burning into me. The mouth was a small, puckered hole. It had long hair like the kind you pull out of a shower drain. It pointed at me with fingers that were jointed and folded like a mantis' pincers. "Who, me?" I mouthed. It nodded, and then it held two of its fingers a short distance apart. Despite its twisted anatomy, I knew an insult when I saw one. That was just cold. I forgot my fear long enough to start cussing it out. My parents both burst through my door to see who I was yelling at. They couldn't see the pucker-faced thing out the window. They couldn't hear its wail. They thought I was on drugs. I wished that I was. I had never felt so alone. Dad dropped me off at school the next morning. I went inside and waited until he left. I'm sorry, but there was no way I could cope with what was happening to me without a little something. I guesstimated at how fast I could jog to the gas station down the street and be back with the excuse that my dad was late. I could usually hustle my way into some cigarettes or something. I needed relief bad, so off I went. No sooner had I reached the station than I had to take a huge dump. So I detoured into the men's room, and there was the biggest, most tattooed and pierced gorilla with a mohawk and beard I had ever seen. He was holding the stall door shut for some reason. He leered at me and winked. I figured he was holding the door so that whoever was in there could have some privacy. So I waited, and waited, and waited. I looked at the bottom of the stall as nonchalantly as possible, and I couldn't see any sign of anyone being in there. What's the deal? Are you holding that for someone using the bathroom? Nah, just waiting for my appointment to show up. Just as soon as he had finished talking, there was the sound of that damn siren. The top of my dick poked up from the top of my jeans like a dog that heard a cheese wrapper. Well, hey, I didn't recognize you. You're even cuter in person, the giant said. Wait, what, me? Oh no, I'm not. Come here, sweet thing. Gunther wants to grease your cookie sheet. I shit myself as I was sprinting away. Warm turds slid down my pant leg and tumbled free. I think that only cranked up Gunther's excitement. "Attaboy, make some room," he bellowed. I reached the school without touching the ground more than 3 times over the whole 5 blocks. I tried to clean up in the boys' room, but I was going to stink past any hope of hiding it. I leaned on the sink and stared into my eyes for a long time. I did my best not to picture Gunther right behind me. Something was wrong. I mean, wrong on a cosmic level. Between the time I got what I wanted from the Olivia and the time that a 6-foot barbarian wanted a quickie in the men's room, something was all screwed up. It had to have been Olivia. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what she had done to me. I wrote her a note with my phone number on it and dropped it in her locker. I thought that I would be in for a huge game of cat and mouse. She replied so quickly that it was as if she had been expecting me to reach out. I was shocked. She was willing to talk. I asked her if I could meet her in public. She floored me a second time by saying yes. I asked her where we could meet. She chose the school basement. Her face was as emotionless as a gravestone, but I swear I saw some whisper of satisfaction in her eyes when she saw the condition I was in. "Did you curse me or something?" "There's a coven in our church congregation. It's just me and a few of the other girls." "So you're seriously a witch?" She nodded. "And you're not even gonna try to deny it?" "Of course not. What are you gonna do? Tell my dad that his daughter's a witch? We do everything online, and it's all encrypted. It's not like you can tattle. Besides, if you try to, I can make things even worse for you." I raised my hand and shook my head. I get it. I just want to know how you did it." "Just a little ritual with some of your DNA." "My DNA? What? One of my hairs?" "No. I had indigestion and kept burping after you left." I blinked and shook my head. "Look, I'm sorry. I'll do anything if you make this stop, whatever this is." "First, you can apologize." "I'm sorry." "Like you mean it." "Okay, I'm really, really sorry." "Words don't mean shit." "What do I have to do in order to convince you that I'm sorry?" She smiled at me in a way that was unsettling. She cast some sort of illusion spell so that my parents wouldn't notice I was gone. She made me use my allowance to buy her dinner at the fanciest ass restaurant we could walk to. She was wearing a dress that was as burgundy as the wine they served in the joint. Not that she could have any since, we were underage. She was running up a real bill, and I knew that was the point. Nobody can put a price on a broken heart, but she sure damn well was going to try. The most sour part was how smoking hot she was. I thought she was a piece to look at before, but she cleaned up to a fine shine, looking every bit as expensive as her daddy's Rolex. She looked like $1 million, and I was starting to think that I had let something really good slip through my hands. "What?" she said, raising her eyebrows. "Huh? What's wrong?" "You were staring." I shook my head and muttered an apology. I wrapped my lips around my knuckles, trying to think of something that wouldn't sound pathetic. "I'm just really good at making bad decisions and not holding on to good things," I said. "And what's that supposed to mean?" The little brat. She knew. I could see it. For starters, I never guessed that I'd meet a preacher's daughter that was a witch at the same time. And second, okay, you look amazing, and it's got me thinking. That you fucked up? I know. I must have looked like I got slapped in the mouth, because she immediately commented on how good the food was. My pride usually kept me from learning any lessons that chicks tried to teach me, but this one was getting past the gates of my ego thanks to the shame I was feeling. "Yeah, you nailed it, and there's nothing realistically I can do to make it up to you. This might pass as a kind gesture, but it doesn't fix how badly I've hurt you." "And you're saying that just because you didn't realize how pretty I can be?" I rolled my eyes so hard. "Say it. Say it. Come on. It's the truth, so say it." "And I'm saying that just because I didn't realize how pretty you can be." God, that smile was so smug. But it was real. "Thank you for dinner," she said, once we had stepped outside into the balmy evening. "Okay, cool. About this curse." "She is Feliciana Goroff." "The hell did you just say?" "Just call her the head siren. She won't respond to that name, but it's what we call her. She can be summoned to harass anyone who has expanded a lot of sexual energy in ways that won't result in a new life." "How do I get her to go away?" She looked at me with eyes enlarged by the night. "We need to perform a spell of abjuration. We'll go to my place since my parents are away again. I'll go down on you again." I was starting to like this abjuration stuff. "And then you'll have to take it back from my mouth and swallow." "Say what? Oh, fuck that." She smiled a smile that screamed, "Gotcha." "You want Feliciana Goroff to go away?" I was cornered. I was desperate. I agreed. We went to her place and I got gobbled. It felt clinical, like it was a business transaction, which made me feel like I was soliciting a hooker. The moment came. Well, I came and then the moment came. She stood up with her cheeks puffed out, and before I could tell her that I needed a moment, she smashed her lips against mine and... I don't want to talk about it. It all happened so fast that my gag reflex was too late. I prayed that I didn't burp. Anything that came up wasn't going to go back down again. When I could breathe without retching, I looked up at her. She was smiling. "So now what?" I said. "That's it. The spell of germination is done? She grinned in a way that sent shivers down my spine. There is no spell of abjuration. My heart sank. Then... why did you just have me... She struck me across the face with a slap like thunder, and I hit the floor hard. Get out! Get out before I call the cops! She kicked me in the stomach, and I thought I was gonna spit myself all over her floor. The more I tried to talk, the more she screamed at me to leave. When I finally got out the door, her laugh rang out through the night air, cruel and jagged and triumphant. It wasn't loud enough to mask the sound of the head siren. It was the first thing I heard when I reached the end of the block. Between the betrayal, disappointment, and the realization of how much danger I was in, I broke into a blind sprint. I was hit by a car. I went to the hospital, where I was in a full-body cast for far too long. It would have been easier to endure if the nurse assigned to me wasn't Gunther, the burly guy from the gas station bathroom. He somehow recognized me through all the bandages, and it just made his day that I was all wrapped up like a Christmas present just for him. He said once I had healed up some, he was gonna drill some holes in my cast so I could be his pokey piñata. Don't ask.
Just looking at the faded poster board sign made me feel sick. From the looks of their website, which looked like it had been created on a Macintosh, Hausen was a cheap, German-themed Disney World rip-off amusement park that popped up seasonally, repurposing what was an airsoft range the rest of the year. I was no linguistics scholar, but I guessed that the place's name, Mausenhausen, was poorly translated German from the English the Mouse House. The dubious declension, I surmised, was to avoid lawsuit-level comparisons to the already existing House of Mouse TV show on the Disney Channel. Even the theme park's mascot, a cartoonish rodent clad in knee-high socks and lederhosen, could have been Mickey's long-lost and genetically deficient Bavarian cousin. However, this unbearably negative attitude couldn't trump the actual reason I had for being there. I needed a job. It was late September, my first autumn out of college, and my parents had given me until the end of the summer to find a steady source of income. I had my 4-year degree, which meant my immediate prospects were about as high as a snail's trail. If only I'd stayed in school a while longer and pushed for that master's, I guess. But no, not even unpaid internships wanted someone like me. It became necessary to broaden my horizons a bit, even into the more, shall we say, undignified depths of employment. Besides being a seasonal attraction, Mausenhausen was due to close down in mid-December until the following fall. Once winter rolled around, I'd be free from its kitschy curse, but then I'd have to find another place to work. Maybe there'd be a Portuguese Dollywood ripoff in the spring waiting for me. Swallowing my pride, I stepped through the gates and made my way to the front office. The park wasn't due to open to the public for a week, so there was a stripped, unfinished look to my surroundings. Cinder blocks, sandbags, and trailers that had left deep tire gouges in the mud. The only way I could deduce the front office from the rest of the trailers was the conspicuous hand-scrawled sign that stated, "Front Office." I walked up the 3 metal steps and knocked on the door. It rattled on its hinges with a plasticky thunk. For a moment, it was silent, but as I raised my knuckles again, A bored voice from within muttered, "Come in." I entered the trailer, lit by a scattering of desk lamps and groaning with an ancient air conditioning unit. The man at the desk was paunchy and sunken-eyed, his dozen or so remaining strands of hair greased neatly over his scalp. He didn't acknowledge me until I took an uneasy seat across from him. "You here for work?" he grunted. "Yes, sir," I replied, a reluctant lump in my throat. "Name," he said, beady eyes swiveling to his laptop. "Taylor Warren," I said. His jaw hung slack as he noisily typed away. I couldn't help but stare at his fingertips, black and grimy with cigarette ash. There was a squeezing pain in my lungs I couldn't place, until I realized I had instinctively held my breath upon entering. I allowed myself to inhale. The odor wasn't as bad as I'd assumed. Still, nowhere I'd like to spend a night, however. "Taylor Warren?" he finally said, pulling up my file. "Yes," I answered. He click-clacked at the keyboard for a minute more. The lack of conversation gave me time to reflect on the application submitted a week prior. It was the typical fare. No, I was never arrested for kiddie fiddling. No, I had never been fired from a job before, implying I had even held a formal job before this one. Yes, I could lift at least 25 pounds. All too familiar for the professional job hunter. The man sniffed gratingly. "Can you lift at least 25 pounds? "Yes," I said, the back of my neck prickling with irritation. "You ever touched any children?" "No." I couldn't entirely hide my welling anger that time. He didn't seem to notice, however. He jabbed the enter key and turned to face me. "All right then, you'll be one of our WODs, that's worker on duty. Your responsibilities will be frontline upkeep around the park, including but not limited to waitering, sanitation, and low-grade maintenance. We will provide a uniform for you. Always remember to put on a happy face in front of our guests. You are the face of Mausen Hausen. Do you have any questions for me?" "Not at the moment," I said, knowing full well I couldn't ask the questions I really wanted to. "I'll see you next week at 7 a.m., he said, turning back to his laptop. "Head straight to this trailer upon arrival for your first assignment. It was nice meeting you, Tony." "Yeah," I mumbled, not bothering to correct him. I sighed, trudging through the dirt back to my car outside the gates. The sun outside was blinding as I departed the stuffy trailer. And they say you can't find work in this economy, I thought sardonically. The following week, at the butt crack of dawn, I walked through the gates towards the same trailer. It had been given a fresh paint job, now the same brown and white European village aesthetic of the newly erected buildings beyond it. I could see down Mausen Hausen's equivalent of Main Street. The various shops, restaurants, and attractions sported lawns of astroturf and gardens of larkspurs. Various other employees, some in character, others in janitorial attire, bustled in and out of sight. An upbeat polka piped from hidden speakers in the facades. Everything looked like it was made of cardboard, like you could breathe on it and it'd come flopping down. The air smelled of soil, fried food, and industry. I wondered just what this place had up its sleeve to keep the children entertained. I worried more for the poor parents who'd be shanghaied into bringing their kids here. I entered the trailer again, and Mr. Greaseball was there on his laptop again. It took him another minute to notice my presence. "Your uniform's in that box over there. Look for your name," he said, gesturing to a plastic container behind me. I rooted through the shrink-wrapped plastic bags until I found Warren Taylor. Ripping it open, I found a simple brown tunic to go over my typical day clothes. I pulled it over my head, and it fit me like a sackcloth. "Your first block, 8 to noon, will be at the Schnitzel restaurant in the town square," Mr. Greaseball explained. He handed me a packet of papers. "Take these to the LOD, that's leader on duty, by the way. Outside the building, they'll give you the run-through before you start. Remember your happy face." "Thanks," I said hesitantly, taking the packet and exiting the trailer. I headed down Main Street, shuffling the papers. A warranty, a W-9, a mission statement. Finally, a map. I located the Schnitzel restaurant in the town square, reading its name aloud. Schnitzkrieg. I groaned, kicking a pebble as I lumbered off. Schnitzkrieg was a greasy, smoky cholesterol pit, where each menu item consisted of various forms of burnt meat on sticks, plus unlimited refills of fountain drinks. Breathing the same air seemed to make my arteries clog and my teeth ache, and that was all before the crowd showed up. Upon their arrival, I suddenly felt like I was swimming through bodies, maneuvering past screaming children and flying food. Within 30 minutes, my tunic was caked in various stains and dribblings. Looking out at the packed restaurant, with the manic children and stoic parents, was like some artistic optical illusion meant to drive onlookers insane slowly. My only duties during the first block were bussing and mopping the occasional spill, which ensured there was never a relaxing moment. Within an hour, I swore the place was conspiring against me, a hydra sprouting 2 more messes each time I tended to one. The sounds of screaming and laughing children became grinding static in my head, leaving scarce room for my mind to wander. It was commitment. Cold, grueling, sheer commitment to a thankless job that just had to be done. Time flew, although when 12 rolled around, I was achy and irritable and famished. I emerged from the restaurant, the smell following me like a shadow, the sunlight blinding me once more. Children still screamed outside, but the open space ensured it was much more petite piercing. A gaggle of boys ran past me. A voice in my head, sounding a lot like Mr. Greaseball, reminded me of my happy face, and I smiled at them. They laughed, pointing in my direction before sprinting off. I scowled. Was it my smile? Was it my messy tunic? Was it just the tunic? I rounded the building into an alleyway to hunker down in solitude and eat my lunch. I was a college graduate, the whole world ahead of me, but it had been a long time since I had ever felt so small. I had 30 minutes before my next assignment, so I took to milling around the park to see just what Mausen Hausen had to offer. It struck me as a scaled-down, lame version of Oktoberfest. I saw more of their mascot, named Klaus the Mouse, plastered over windows and painted on walls. There was live music, a petting zoo with pigs and geese, make-your-own sausage booths, folk dance classes, and a wild mouse roller coaster. Ha ha. At least they had a beer fountain for the adults. Otherwise, the park was surprisingly small, able to be exhausted of its attractions in maybe half a day at most. I wondered if I would even have been able to enjoy this place as a kid myself. Was this really all it had to offer? The answer came right before I was due for my next assignment. Guten Tag, Kinder, a voice boomed. I turned to look at the crowd of children and parents gathered around a wooden stage adorned with curtains. The mustachioed man with the microphone was wiry and jittery. I could see his bulging eyes and stained teeth from 50 feet away. Guten Tag! The kids in the audience shouted back. My brow furrowed. Apparently, they were more privy to this place's traditions than I'd thought. What all had I missed out on the last 4 years mired in academics? I hope you're all enjoying this year's opening day of Mausen Hausen, the announcer yelled. Let me hear some noise! The kids cheered in response. Now, I know why you're all gathered here at this time, he continued. You came here to listen to me prattle on about the history of the park, right? The children went quiet. Or you came here to see the man of the hour, or, should I say, the mouse of the hour. They exploded with cheers again. Well, I won't keep you waiting any longer. Without further ado, here he is, the only critter on Earth who loves cheese and dances a mean Schuhplattler, Klaus the Mouse. And from behind the curtains bounded a thing. The children seemed to love it, and the adults didn't seem to react too strongly. But I actually leaned forward to get a better look. The creature? Entity? Whatever it was skipped to center stage and broke into a jig, tapping its feet, slapping its thighs and ankles. My first thought was, wow, no wonder the rest of the park looks half-assed. They dumped their entire budget into this ultra-realistic Klaus the Mouse puppet. But the longer I watched, the more I realized its movements were much too realistic, much too organic, for even the most convincing puppet. An animatronic, then? Robotics had come a long way in recent decades, but it sounded like I was only trying to reassure myself. That thing's balance and fluidity were impeccable. That sort of technology should have appeared first in hospitals or the military, not this half-rate German Disneyland. That only left a little person in a convincing costume. Yet, somehow, that explanation seemed just as implausible. There was something about its joints, its fur, its small, black, shiny eyes. The way the sun passed through its oversized ears, revealing brief flashes of blood vessels under its skin. My jaw dropped. This thing, it was real. I had no idea how long its little dance went on for, but then it was bowing to the raucous crowds and skipping off behind the wings. Wasn't that a treat? The announcer proclaimed. If you want to see Klaus again, he'll be back at 3:30 and 6 o'clock to dance and share what he has to say. The crowd dispersed. People shifted around me like river water flowing past a rock. Were they not as dumbfounded as I was? As astounded that something like that creature existed and could walk among us? Why couldn't they see that a living, breathing contradiction of everything we knew to be true and holy was in front of their faces? Hey, aren't you supposed to start your 1 o'clock? A sharp voice jabbed. I snapped out of it. My LOD from Schnitzkrieg was scowling at me. Where's your next station? Check your packet. I rummaged my hands through my pockets, still in a daze. I don't know. The LOD whipped out a packet with a snap. "You just so happened to leave it at the restaurant. You're supposed to be at the petting zoo now. Get moving." "What was that?" I mumbled, gesturing weakly at the empty stage. "Klaus the mouse?" the LOD said impatiently. "You know, our mascot? On your way now. The hay isn't going to sweep itself up." "But it's real," I insisted, forcing my tongue to work correctly. The LOD shook his head. "Klaus has been our icon for years now. He might as well be. Now, on your way." I took my packet back, too disoriented to argue further. Although my next 4 hours were spent clearing the petting zoo's walkway of straw and animal dung, Klaus danced that manic jig in my mind. The void of thought working at Mausen had suddenly become occupied by that creature. The stage was across the park from the petting zoo, but I still heard the music at 3:30 sharp. I had to figure it out. I had to figure out where it came from, what it was all about, and, if possible, what exactly it was. As the rest of the week dragged on, I continued sneaking over to Klaus's performances, each as joyously received as the first. He danced most of the time, but he took the microphone and spoke other times. His voice was chipper and bright, like a kid excited to tell Mom about his day. He told jokes, stories, and even called on some of the kids to share what they liked most about Mausen Hausen. I watched each of these interactions with complete incredulity, witnessing these very real children seem to cross some unimaginable plane and reach out to this very real thing without a second's worth of hesitation or foresight. It did something to me. The closest phrase I can conjure for what I felt was existential dread. The proper words, I knew, were something I couldn't express. But the more I watched, the more I figured out exactly what went on behind the curtain. Klaus would be accompanied by the mustachioed man to a golf cart covered in a black tarp, then shuttled off to a nondescript hut hidden behind the folk dance emporium. From the few times I glimpsed this process, the abode appeared unguarded and unlocked. Trusting people, I mused. They never counted on an idiot like me popping in on their magical talking rodent. The following Monday, the weekday I determined would be least crowded in the evenings, would be the day. I'd stay in the park past the end of my shift and sneak over to that hut to do something. Peer through the window, creak the door open, maybe even meet the mouse itself. Anything to get to the bottom of this. The evening seemed to crash down on us that time of year. The crowds thinned quickly, and Klaus was wrapping up his final show for the day. As tired parents milled towards the exits, holding their jittery children's hands, I watched them go through the window of the bratwurst shack I had been assigned to bus that afternoon. The restaurant had technically closed an hour earlier, but I had been instructed to lock up. No one had bothered to check otherwise. Main Street was completely empty when I finally exited the shack and locked the door. One more scan confirmed I was alone. No guests, no other employees. I then hopped the white picket fence that sectioned off the backs of the buildings. Unseen by the guests, the backside of the park's buildings was made of bare wooden supports and scaffolding. Plastic fluttered in the breeze. The curated lawns and gardens gave way to trash-strewn dirt. The festive music from the park's interior took on a muted, ghostly warble. It was like crossing the tracks to the wrong side of town. I could almost see the daylight fading into inky night as I crept forward to the back of the dance emporium. Klaus never struck me as scary on his own, but the path leading up to him filled me with some cold, subtle, loathsome sensation. His little hut was scarcely the size of a typical kitchen. It boasted a cottage aesthetic, complete with a smoking chimney that otherwise would have been cute. It almost seemed homey, like they had gone the extra mile to make this thing live comfortably. As I approached the front door, I saw I'd have to duck to move around within it. I bent my trembling knees and raised a shaky fist at the door. Knock, knock. I gulped and opened the door. The interior was pastel-colored wood, lit with the warm glow of old-fashioned lanterns mounted on the walls. A tiny nook to my right was the kitchen, a pot of boiling water emitting steam up a vent. A bed, the size of a crib, sat to my left, complete with a scaled-down dresser drawer. And ahead of me, a small armchair sat in front of an old-fashioned television, blaring with the bright colors and sounds of cartoons. The chair's back was to me, but I could see its occupant's hairy, noodly arm poking out its side. After a moment of silence, Klaus the mouse turned in his seat to take a look at me.
"Oh, hello,"
he said.
"I haven't had you visit me before. You work here, right?"
Words failed me. I never knew reality could bludgeon me so hard, but Klaus the mouse was sitting right there. I almost couldn't look at him. My eyes were rejecting what lay so plainly in front of them. The moisture was lining his eyes, and there was a slight twitch in his cheek. Even the way his body heaved slightly with each breath. Nothing about him screamed fake. His smile faltered slightly. He seemed to sense my unease.
"Are you all right, friend? Do you need me to fetch one of our medics?"
"No," I gasped. No, I'm okay. It's just..." Now that I knew he was real, my mind jumped to another planet of possibilities. A spirit incarnate. A genetic experiment. Some long-lost species.
"You look faint,"
said Klaus, springing from his seat.
"Here, take my chair. I fear if you collapse in my house, I won't be strong enough to drag you out."
I obeyed the talking mouse and shuffled over to his tiny armchair. It creaked under my weight, and the armrests squashed my sides, but somehow it held. Klaus was at eye level with me now, his hands folded behind his back. It astonished me how his cartoonish features, the overly large head, tubular limbs, upturned extended snout, seemed almost natural. Literally one of those old rubber hose characters made flesh.
"Can I get you some cheese?"
said Klaus, strolling over to his kitchen.
"Afraid all I have is Buttercase, but I'm sure you like it." "Yes, sir. That's the stuff."
Apologies if I sound rude," I stammered, knowing there was no way not to sound rude. "But what exactly are you?" He appeared next to me with a platter of yellowish, porous cheese.
"I'm a mouse, of course. I mean, look at me. I got the ears, I got the whiskers, I got the... Oh no, wait a minute."
He spun around, revealing a ribbony tail poking from the seat of his lederhosen.
"Oh, there's my tail. It looks like I do have all the right parts."
He laughed again, holding out the platter.
"Here you go, friend."
I hesitantly took a piece of cheese, but simply held it as I continued to stare. I mean, like, where did you come from? How did you get here?
Well, I walked here, silly.
He clicked his heels.
You think I wear these shoes just for show?
No, that's not what I meant. I sputtered. My brain was a rolling pile of marbles, unable to clump together. I mean, were you born? Were you created? Summoned? What?
Ah, my friend, those are silly questions.
He sat down on the floor next to me, turned towards the TV.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm with Mausen, and I couldn't imagine a better place to be.
I sighed. Somehow I knew he was being serious, even if he was also being naive. Okay, how about this? What's the earliest thing you can remember? Think back. Klaus went silent, and at first I thought he hadn't heard me. Then...
I can't say. I've been performing and entertaining here as far back as I care to go.
Can you remember a time before Hausen? He shook his head, his ears flopping.
Nope.
Well, what about when Hausen shuts down for the season? I pressed. Surely you have to go somewhere during that time. He went silent again.
What do you mean, shut down?
Hausen is a seasonal attraction, I explained. It's only around for 3 or 4 months a year. After that, they deconstruct everything and this whole place turns back into an airsoft range. His eyes narrowed, like a kid contemplating a word problem.
Hausen goes away?
Yeah, December to August.
So...
His gaze dropped.
Where do I go?
I don't know, I answered with a shrug. You tell me. Klaus twirled his finger on the carpet. I watched him, holding my breath, waiting for an answer. Have you ever even left the park? I continued. Klaus shook his head again.
Why would I? This is all I am.
He frowned.
Is it?
That's what we're trying to figure out here, I said softly. Klaus stood up, still gazing at the floor. He wandered over to his kitchen, the spring gone from his step.
Is this right? Is my life bound to Hausen? What more is there?
His eyes glazed over as he reached for the pot of boiling water.
What am I supposed to do?
The piece of cheese in my hand had become molten. I didn't mean any of that, I insisted, twisting around to look at him. I just wanted to know. Distracted and zoned out, Klaus dragged the pot a little too far off the burner. Steaming water spilled from the overturned pot across the tile. I remember gasping, jumping to my feet and hitting my head against the low ceiling, but I don't remember the actual drop. All I know is that one moment everything was fine. An instant later, Klaus was on the floor, wailing, his hand and leg scalded. Shit! I cried. Klaus, are you okay? Klaus continued to sob, scooting away from the boiling puddle and curling into a protective stance. Stay put, Klaus. I'll get help. I made my way for the tiny doorway, straightening once I hit the cold air outside, and sprinted around the dance emporium towards Main Street. A stitch flared in my side as I ran. The saccharine folk music continued to blare through the empty park. The buildings were shadowy and imposing, as if their dark windows were black eyes, judging me. Help! Someone help! I shouted. But all that responded was the fleeting ring of my voice bouncing off the walls. I sped up. There was only one person in the park I could rightfully assume was still in his place. I caught him just in time outside his trailer. Sir! I called out, skidding to a stop. Excuse me, sir! Klaus is hurt. Hurt? How so? Mr. Greaseball said. A pot of boiling water spilled on him, I gasped. He's burned badly. How do you know this? He said. Were you trying to visit him? I was just... You're not one of his handlers, so you're not supposed to talk to Klaus, Mr. Greaseball snapped. You're not even supposed to be on the premises right now. Get out and go home, now. I stuttered, but Mr. Greaseball turned and lumbered off towards the dance emporium, barking into a walkie-talkie. I turned and stumbled out of the park gates in a gravid daze. I spent the rest of the night sitting sleeplessly in my room, my throat locked up with shame, confusion, defiance. What just happened? A simple question had never seemed so imposing, so laden with consequence and implication. I showed up for work the next day. Mr. Greaseball was waiting for me. You, inside. He pointed to his trailer. I sighed and followed him in, sitting across his desk. We were able to treat Klaus's injuries, he said, not looking at me. But he's still in a lot of pain. He won't be able to perform at all for today at least. I'm sorry, I croaked. What were you doing in Klaus's hut anyway? I just wanted to see him. Is that all? I hesitated, then nodded. The way Klaus says it, Mr. Greaseball growled. You talked about some pretty deep topics. Distressing topics. I mean, I was just trying to... Klaus has been our mascot for years, he cut in. He's a beacon of absolute good, the unspoiled fantasy of children. You can't just barge in and poison him with your thoughts. I didn't know, I protested. I mean, how was I supposed to know he'd react that way? He's not just in pain, he interrupted again. He's upset. He's asking questions he has no right asking. I found my voice. Okay, listen to me. What is Klaus? I get Klaus is your mascot, but that's a character. Mickey Mouse is a character, SpongeBob is a character. But none of those guys walk around in the flesh. How and why does your mascot get to have that distinction? Mr. Greaseball shook his head. If I knew, kid, I wouldn't tell you. Then who does know? I want to talk to them. He stood up. I was hoping it wouldn't go both ways. But now you're getting into the questions you have no right asking. You're hiding something, I shouted, standing likewise. You're hiding what he is and where he came from. What is he? What did you do? You don't know what we have. We don't know what we have. You continue to push the limits. You'll dig up something ugly. There are no limits here except the ones you've set down. You can't keep pushing away the truth. Your employment is terminated, said Mr. Greaseball. You're a negative influence on Klaus and an inappropriate fit for Mausen Hausen. Please turn in your uniform. You are all sick! Sick lying bastards! I tore my tunic off and threw it in a ragged heap on his desk. Surprisingly, Mr. Greaseball frowned. That's not fair. I stormed out of his trailer, slamming the door shut behind me. That's not fair, I repeated out loud. Fairness be damned. None of those basic pleasantries mattered in the face of what I had seen. Naturally, my parents were upset that I'd lost my job after 1 week. They didn't want to hear about Mausen Hausen's living, sentient mascot, nor how I had engaged in an existential conversation with him, brief as it was. I wanted to tell them I could become an award-winning journalist by breaking a story about a walking, talking mouse. But instinct said I needed to look into it more on my own first. Speaking of which, my attempts at Googling Klaus yielded no useful information. I got an article in the local paper about the park reopening and Hausen's archaic website. I was baffled. Had not one child or adult ever whipped out their cell phone and recorded Klaus's little dance? Was the park restricting filming and photography? I doubted it, as I'd seen plenty of parents taking pictures of their kids in my 1 week there. Mr. Greaseball had to have been bullshitting me. I may have been fired, but I realized soon after that didn't mean I was banned from the park. When Wednesday morning rolled around, I pulled out of the driveway under the guise of job hunting. The bored ticket girl at the front gates didn't even look at me as she took my $20 and handed over my pass. I did, however, nearly jog past the front office. Mr. Greaseball was weird enough without him having fired me barely 24 hours earlier. I hunkered down in a restaurant's outdoor patio until 1:30. Everything felt heavy as I finally stood up and gravitated towards the wooden stage. "Wow, that sure was the longest day of my life," Mr. Mustache said to the crowd. "But Klaus is feeling good again. Let's give him a hand!" The children clapped and cheered. "I won't keep you all waiting much longer. Here he is, the mouse of the hour!" Klaus walked out from behind the wings. His hand and calf were wrapped in gauze, but he smiled and waved nonetheless at his jubilant fans. I stayed back, obscured behind a rather burly dad. God forbid if he recognized me and called me out mid-show.
Guten Tag, friend.
Klaus said, his voice a bit diminished.
I appreciate all the support you've shown me over the last runs. I had a little accident, see? So sadly, I won't be able to dance for you right now.
A few kids awed, but Klaus continued.
Instead, let's just talk. A little heart to heart, you know? Tell me, kids, who here has been hurting lately?
The crowd was silent. I noticed them stealing uneasy glances at each other.
Anyone?
Klaus prompted.
Anyone fallen off the bike? Been sick? Something like that?
A kid up front raised his hand. My dog, Rascal, he bit my arm the other day.
Goodness!
Klaus piped.
Why did Rascal bite your arm?
The kid shrugged. I was teasing him with treats.
Teasing him with treats?
Klaus parroted.
No less than you deserve.
Even in the back, I saw the boy wince with shame. Klaus began pacing the stage.
You see, kids, my time off has given me a lot of time to think. And I learned that while hurting might feel bad, it's important. It helps you grow up. It helps you realize the truth about the world. Outside Mausen, there's nothing but pain. You might think about staying here with me in this carnival land with its tasty food and fun rides. But in time, you'll learn that staying here will hurt you more than the world ever will.
Klaus could have dropped his pants and flashed his tiny rodent dick to the children, and I don't think I'd have been more shocked. A few parents had already dragged their kids away from the stage. All the others were fidgeting uncomfortably.
I want you to look at the kid to your right,
said Klaus.
And I want you to give them a little pinch. Just a little nip on the arm. Go ahead, do it.
The kids began to murmur. The crowd started to come apart. Then, a girl squealed from the center left, jumping back and rubbing her forearm.
Yes, you're beginning to understand,
Klaus declared. The girl cowered and sniffled, while the boy to her left simply stared at her, confused and upset.
This is what you'll have to look forward to once you leave the park today, little girl,
the mascot declared.
I implore you to savor it and prepare yourself for the ultimate show, death.
Mr. Mustache flew onto the stage and wrenched the microphone from Klaus's grasp. "Let's hear it for Klaus the Mouse, kids!" he cried. "Klaus is still running a bit of a fever, I'm afraid, but he'll be back to his old self after another day's rest." He grabbed the mouse's forearm and practically threw him behind the curtains. The crowd departed unceremoniously, and suddenly, I was just standing there alone and exposed. "Hey!" Mr. Greaseball was huffing his way down Main Street, pointing at me. "You! What are you doing here? Were you spurning Klaus?" Anger flared in me once more. I didn't say shit to him. He didn't even see me. "You shouldn't be here," Mr. Greaseball wheezed. "What is your damage, kid?" "Like you don't know?" I shouted, gesturing at the stage. "Get out of here. You're no longer allowed in Hausen. At all." I made a move to lunge at him, but faltered at the sight of 3 LODs converging upon us. "Don't bother," I spat at them. "I was just leaving." I turned and stormed off. "We all heard what Klaus said up there," I proclaimed. "You can't deny what's happening." They didn't say a word back to me. Somehow their silence said a lot more to me than I could have known. Employees and guests stared at me as I headed for the exit gates. But the further I distanced myself from the park, the more my anger ebbed away. Somehow, I knew they'd agreed with me. I had gathered a lot in my 1 week at Hausen. Not just of the existence of Klaus, but that the chain-link fences that sectioned off the property weren't very strong or well-maintained. The next evening, skirting along the thin, wiry walls, I found an entryway opened up by a fallen tree. I slipped my way in. I found myself behind the buildings once more, that bizarrely barren, half-finished zone that felt like some shadowy, apocalyptic parallel dimension. I was alone, but on high alert. I was at no point in my life to drum up a criminal record just yet. I crept past the buildings to where I knew Klaus's hut was. Before turning the last corner, however, I hesitated. After shattering his innocence and stirring up trouble with management, I assumed that they'd have tightened security around his compound. And, sure enough, as I peered around a wooden beam, someone was standing guard outside his door. I groaned, hiding behind the beam. But something about the guard seemed strange. She was young, with a rueful, disinterested expression. Then it hit me. She was the ticket girl from the previous morning. I scowled. She couldn't be Hausen top brass. Hell, she was probably in the same boat as I had been. Why would they entrust a low-level employee to such an important task? And would she react as caustically as a higher-ranking worker to my unlawful presence in the park? I took my chance and walked out to her.
"Hey, who are you?"
she said, reaching for her walkie-talkie. "Wait, don't call Mr. Greaseball," I blurted.
"Who?"
She froze. I hesitated. "Sorry, the fat guy who works in the front office."
"Oh, Mr. Gruber,"
she confirmed.
"You know him? Do you work here?"
I did, but they fired me, unjustly. The ticket girl's eyes widened.
"Oh my God. For what?"
"Seeing something I shouldn't have," I answered. "They also banned me from setting foot on the premises, but you're not going to report me, are you?"
"Not at all,"
she said with a shrug.
"There's some crazy shit around here. I damn near fainted when I first saw Klaus perform."
"Do you know what he is?" I asked.
"No,"
she said.
"I stopped questioning it days ago. Now, I just take it in stride."
"So you're not one of his handlers, right?"
"The LODs did that,"
the girl said.
"but Klaus won't cooperate with them anymore. He believes they're smothering him. He'll tolerate people like me, as long as I keep quiet.
Well, I need to see him, I replied. I know Klaus has been acting up lately. I think I can help fix things. The ticket girl looked back at the door.
You sure you want to see him? It's pretty gross in there.
I'm sure. But as she stepped aside and I made for the door, I frowned. Pretty gross? I almost fainted upon entering the hut. The interior looked like it had aged 30 years. The paint was peeling. The floors were smeared with black stains. The little armchair had chunks taken out of it and was overturned. The television was off. A closer look revealed an ugly crack in the screen. I looked around for Klaus. He was not in immediate sight. Instead, my nose found him. A putrid, fecal odor emanating from one of the cabinets in the tiny kitchen. At the base of the door, I saw bits of chewed-up sticks and leaves, and dark brown pellets I took to be droppings. Covering my nose and mouth, I threw open the door. Klaus was curled up in a decrepit nest underneath the sink. He seemed to be cuddling with a stuffed animal, but the closer I regarded it, the harder a new smell hit. The scent of rotten meat.
Oh,
Klaus muttered.
it's you. Are you here to give me another life lesson?
Klaus, I breathed. What are you doing?
Thinking. That's what I'm doing.
Klaus crawled out of the cabinet. His outfit was soiled and torn. Patches were missing from his fur, and his hand and leg were nearly bald from his burns. He flung the stuffed animal onto the floor, and I realized with disgust that it was a dead rat, dissecting its abdomen.
I've been convening with my brethren, you see.
He gestured towards the carcass.
They don't quite understand me, but I've learned a lot from them. For instance, that an animal's head ought not to be bigger than its body.
He smacked the side of his head so hard his eyes glazed over.
That all these insights serve a purpose.
He picked up the rat by its tail, looping a free finger through an intestine and pulling it out.
That everything in this world has reasoning and order.
He let it drop with a light thud.
That I don't belong.
Klaus, I protested, averting my eyes from the grisly scene. Of course you belong.
Do I?
He retorted, standing up.
Look at you. Free to walk and to choose and to live. Even these rats, all they're concerned with is feeding and fleeing. But they live in fear. Do you know why? Because there are things out there to fear. There's so much out there. And I've been forced into being. Nothing else like me exists in this world because this world wasn't designed to host things like me. Can you think of a single other thing in this world that fits my purpose?
Mickey Mouse, SpongeBob? I replied. They're mascots too. They've been making children happy for decades now.
None of them walk around, though.
He fired back.
None of them know what it's like to be sore at the end of the day, or the pain of a nail driving through your hand. I've got a head start on pain, my friend.
He held up his hand, and I cringed at the sight of a hole in his palm, the perfect size for a nail.
I know those flat, lifeless drawings never will, and I have you to thank for it.
Klaus, please, I said. I never wanted any of this for you. I was just curious. I wanted to know exactly what you were... Klaus stamped his foot.
You don't think I've been wondering the same thing? I was put into this world under the guise of spending my days entertaining children. All the memories to be made, the experiences to be had, just transpiring beyond the park. I might have spent eternity doing those same stupid dances because I thought that's what happiness was.
His beady black eyes brimmed with tears.
Now that I know better, all that happiness is gone. But will I find it again? With a world so big and confusing, is anyone truly happy?
Klaus fell to the floor, weeping. I knelt before him. Klaus, I'm so sorry you're having these thoughts. And I'm so sorry that I'm the one who triggered them. All I can say is, happiness isn't something you find. Happiness is something you make for yourself. He sat up, rubbing his eyes.
None of that matters.
He sobbed.
I shouldn't exist. No one knows how I got here or what I am. Not you, not me, not the men who run the park. That much is apparent. I don't deserve to share in what you all have.
I tried to speak up again, but the ticket girl's voice from outside interrupted.
Mr. Gruber, we have a problem over here.
I left Klaus on the floor and nearly blew the small door off its hinges getting outside. What the hell are you doing? I demanded. The ticket girl backed up, her walkie-talkie tight in her grasp.
I'm sorry, I heard him crying and I just had to say something.
You just ruined everything, I scolded. The ticket girl scowled.
Me? By the looks of things, you're the one screwing up Klaus with whatever you're telling him.
Don't tell me you too have bought into this place's cult, I shouted.
What are you talking about?
She argued.
I'm just doing my job. There's no cult to be found here. Like I said, I just take it all in stride.
I heard the sounds of an approaching mob. I shot one more nasty glare at the ticket girl, turned, and bolted. The moon had long risen by the time I squeezed through the chain-link fence and reached my car, pulled over near the tree line surrounding the park. I half expected to see police sirens flaring in my rearview mirror on my drive home, but the night remained silent and calm. Apart from a few passing headlights, only me and my thoughts were there. They made for lousy company. Klaus appeared to me later that night. He was garbed in his complete outfit, colorful and clean, the pure, innocent, glowing character imagined by a child. He stepped over me as I lay in bed, his shoes digging into my flesh. Hands folded behind his back, he shook his head and tut-tutted.
Well. You just couldn't take it in stride, could you?
I tried to reply, but my chest seemed constricted by his heels.
I'm not sure why you're acting so surprised.
Klaus continued.
I mean, you're right all along. I couldn't have been real. I was merely a figment of a children's imagination made flesh. Incompatible with the intricacies of reality. So what did you expect when you laid all that existential baggage upon me?
I was just curious, I gasped. The difficulty of getting those strangled words out made me lightheaded. But Klaus just laughed.
Curiosity killed the cat. Or mauled the mouse, roasted the rodent, whichever you prefer. Regardless, my prying friend, you wanted to understand, and now you've got your wish. My handlers are in disarray. The park is failing, and I'm dying as we speak. You wanted to turn on a light, but you burned everything down. Is this what you wanted?
I found my voice. Is it a sin to want to know? Klaus shrugged.
Maybe not. But one thing I've learned about this world is that so much is predicated on faith. You have faith that things will get better. You have faith that things are the way they are because of so-and-so. You have faith that living a certain way will get you eternally rewarded. And if you splash cold reality all over that faith, it dies. Think about it this way, friend. If God revealed himself right now, would his followers' faith be proven? No, it would die. Because then believing in God would be a matter of truth, not faith. Those who refuse to acknowledge his coming would be the darkened, ignorant ones for not realizing what's so blatantly obvious. But life is never that simple. God stays in heaven. Science cannot prove or disprove him. Yet the people believe he's up there.
Are you comparing yourself to God? I asked. Klaus puckered his lips and raised a finger to silence me.
No, friend. All I'm saying is some things are a matter of faith. That some things you must simply take in stride.
When I opened my eyes next, it was morning. My bedroom door was closed, and my covers were undisturbed. I'm pretty certain it was a dream, but as far as dreams go, that one seemed pretty genuine. Normal, even. Well, normal as far as existential talking mice go. I went downstairs for breakfast, and there was an envelope on the table.
Found it on the front doorstep.
My mom said without looking at me.
It's for you, from Hausen.
I picked it up with trepidation. Across my name and address were the red, stamped-on words, Notice of Termination.
Talk about adding insult to injury,
My mom commented.
Belated as it seems.
I rolled my eyes at her and opened it up. But it was an old-fashioned glossy photograph that fell out of the envelope. Confused, I picked it up off the tabletop and looked at it. It was Klaus, spread-eagled on the floor of his hut, lying in a pool of blood. His forearms were shiny and crimson. Nestled in his limp grasp was a large, rusty nail. The timestamp showed roughly 1 hour after I had fled the park the previous night. Mortified, I grabbed the envelope to reveal the return address, but in its place was a cartoon mock-up of Klaus the Mouse.
Hope your job search is going well,
My mom said.
Hello? Am I getting through to you?
It's fine, I said, my voice sounding miles away. I was just thinking about moving on.
Good,
She replied before shuffling out of the kitchen. I folded the photograph and stuffed it in my pocket. Best not to simply throw it away in case it was discovered. God forbid what the sight of a dead, bloody Klaus would do to the hundreds of children who loved him. I shambled back up to my room, wondering if Klaus the Mouse was currently embarking on his next big journey.
There's this little flower shop on the way home from the office. At least I thought it was a flower shop. The sign on the window says, Granny's Yarbs and Apothecary. I wasn't sure what to make of a name like that, but since the dirty shop windows were filled with plants and blooms, I figured they sold flowers. I stepped in there back in February of last year. That was just before Madison started to change. My family prides itself on how down-to-earth we are, so it's a tradition that every Montgomery comes home after he gets his MBA and spends a few years running the first factory that our great-great-great-grandfather built. This isn't really home to any of us anymore. In my case, I mostly grew up in Eastern boarding schools, but the tradition still keeps us grounded. My wife hated it here from the moment we drove my Jaguar down the dark, twisty, potholed, 2-lane road to this god-forsaken place. But Madison knew the rules when she agreed to become Mrs. Mortimer Montgomery. The standard Montgomery prenuptial agreement spelled out how she would have to live with me as my wife for 2 years before she'd be entitled to anything at all in a divorce. Montgomery men have been marrying and divorcing trophy wives for a long, long time, and we can afford the best lawyers money can buy, so it's an airtight contract. Plus, as I told Madison when she complained about having to live out in the sticks with me for 2 entire years, It's not as if I had it any better. The terms of the Montgomery Family Trust are as crystal clear and binding on me as the prenup is on her. I have to run that first Montgomery Mechanicals factory until the next Montgomery in line mints his MBA, and that's going to be at least 3 years by the looks of things. If I don't stick it out, I won't get my full share of the family fortune. I told her that living in the hills, far beyond civilization, was just something we had to endure for the sake of our future. How bad could it be? It's not like I'm a monster. I wanted my wife to be happy, if only so my life at home would be more pleasant. That's why I stopped to buy her those damn flowers. A bell jangled when I opened the squeaky door to Granny's Yarbs and Apothecary. I don't know why there was a bell, because the entire shop was just a single tiny room, packed tight with shelves, what looked like a kitchen table, and a rocking chair in the center of the room. The shelves were full of jars and vials and bottles and bits of dried plants. The table was cluttered with bowls, trays, and a mortar and pestle. The rocking chair, meanwhile, contained an old hillbilly woman. The old woman looked up at me as I entered her little shop. Her long hair was thin and white, but at least it seemed to have been recently washed and combed. Her face was thin, but somehow strong, even though she looked to be short of stature and frail of bone. She wore a dress made of blue fabric with tiny flowers all over it. The cut of the dress was nothing like what women wear outside of the hills. Mausen called the style, favored by the crones of the area, hill shack chic, but there was nothing chic about it. The old woman didn't think so much as to stand up to greet me as I creaked across the floor's wooden planks. She just kept rocking as she met my eyes. "What's it that you're wanting?" she asked me. Fortunately, I'm good with languages, having spent so much time abroad. By then, I'd picked up enough of the peculiar local dialect to understand her question. Naturally, I answered with perfect English. "I'd like a bouquet of flowers for my wife, the best you have." She rocked and considered my request before replying. "Ain't no near had no Montgomery in air before." The smell of dried flowers, pungent ointments, I didn't want to think about too much, and what looked like 5 dead possums hanging by their tails over the back door filled the place with an oppressive scent. I wanted to leave and never come back. Instead of giving in to my impulses to flee, though, I reminded myself that once I got my full inheritance, I could buy up what little of the town my family didn't already own. Thus encouraged, I responded with a tone that I intended to communicate to this granny person that I was indeed her better. "If your bouquet pleases my bride, perhaps I'll return for additional purchases in the future. Be warned, however, that my wife's standards are quite high." It was certainly true that Madison's standards in matters such as fashion, home decor, and floral arrangements were indeed quite high. I was pretty sure that those high standards were the biggest reason she agreed to marry me at all, since few other men could afford for her to live up to those very high standards. The old woman's piercing blue eyes bore into mine as she rose from her chair and announced, "Even if she's got mighty particular standards, I reckon I'll make a bouquet that'll have your missus sending you back for more." "That will be fine," I told her, happy to be done with the conversation. The way she said bouquet with a strange elocution, and the emphasis on the first syllable, grated on me. Perhaps it just reminded me too much of the way certain undesirable elements refer to the police, but I reminded myself that this was just how these people talked. I contemplated the ways in which language reveals breeding as the old woman rummaged through her prodigious supplies. She cut some handsome blossoms off a live plant with a slender-bladed knife that she produced from a pocket in her dress. Then, with a quickness that belied her advanced age and slow demeanor, The old woman assembled a large bundle of fresh-cut flowers and foliage, added generous clumps of dried flowers she carefully selected from a high shelf, and then tied a black ribbon around all of the stems. Finally, she dipped the cut stems into a jar filled with some kind of an anointment before handing me the non-traditional but yet somehow still attractive arrangement. "That'll be $5, mister, if your missus likes it, and I know she sure will. There's more where that came from." I handed over my money and vacated the premises as fast as I could. The bare branches of the trees groped overhead as I drove my jag as fast as I dared on my way home to Madison. In the beginning, living here was harder on Madison than it was on me. I at least had the dilapidated factory half-staffed with desultory hillbillies to go to. But Madison was stuck in the big, gloomy mansion my great-great-grandfather had built to his particular tastes. He'd situated the place well outside of town and away from what he termed the riffraff. In her prior life, Madison had lived a life of soirees, ladies' lunches, and upscale shopping with her posh friends. The Ozark Hills lack of any sort of cultured activities, and they certainly didn't have any suitably posh women to be Madison's friends. Poor Madison went from her honeymoon on the French Riviera directly to the Ozarks. We had a gay time along the Mediterranean. Madison laughed and drank bottles of white wine on the beach, and she even felt amorous a few times after the wedding night. Most importantly, she was a beautiful woman on my arm, playing the part of Mrs. Mortimer Montgomery very well when we met family, friends, and colleagues on their holidays. But, like all good things, the honeymoon came to an end, and we had to move to where my family's from. I spent as little time as possible in the Ozarks growing up, and I desperately looked forward to doing that again. As I drove home with the first bouquet, I thought that my interaction with the proprietress of Granny's Yarbs and Apothecary had gone better than I'd expected. Locals often refused to have anything to do with us, even when we were trying to patronize their businesses. But the old woman had seemed at least somewhat pleased to service my needs. I lost myself in daydreaming that perhaps I'd be the first Montgomery to win over the local populace to serve as an appropriately grateful workforce for our endeavors. It's not easy living amongst people who hate you for your hard work, intelligence, and inevitable success. The locals have never cared for my family. Montgomery Mechanicals is the only major employer for 100 miles around, so you'd think that the desperately poor people living here would appreciate us, but you'd be quite wrong in thinking that. My great-great-grandfather kept a diary, and even back in the beginning of our company, he wrote about the ungrateful, lazy hillbillies who tried to burn his factory down after he brought in strikebreakers. Alas, the situation's not improved in the many years since Maximilian Montgomery first built the factory deep in the Ozarks. Poor Maximilian was only there because the equally ungrateful people of rural Alabama had turned on him in those tumultuous years after the Civil War. Maximilian had traveled from Boston to assist the people in the rural South with their reconstruction, and while my ancestor made a large profit in Alabama, he was not well received by the shiftless local populace. And before you even start thinking that my forebearer was a racist, I must inform you that Maximilian's exit from Alabama involved the only mixed-race mob in Alabama history. Apparently, sloth and ungratefulness is common in both races in rural Alabama. The malice toward us in the Ozarks was so bad that Madison wasn't even able to hire household help from the local stock. From the look of the shacks these people lived in, I expected that we'd be overwhelmed with qualified applicants when we took out an ad in the weekly newspaper offering to pay the outrageous sum of $7.50 an hour for a woman to cook and clean for us in the mansion. But there wasn't a single applicant for the position. There's no explanation for that lack of initiative other than laziness and overgenerous governmental welfare. We eventually had to bring a woman in from overseas to cook and clean. She was from Slovenia, I think, or maybe Slovakia. It's some Eastern European nation where the peasants were sufficiently desperate to commit to 3 years of servitude in order to come to America. Of course, those stupid immigrants never expected that a job in America will be in a backward, accursed place they'd never heard of. The conditions of the community came as quite a surprise to our Slovakian peasant woman. I think that she would have left us by Christmas if we hadn't taken her passport from her when she arrived. I had to search for Madison when I got home with that first bouquet. I even resorted to asking the peasant woman in the kitchen if she knew where my wife was, but the stupid thing just blanched and shook her head at me as she babbled something in her strange language. With no help coming from the Slovakian woman, I set off hunting for my wife, my bouquet held firmly in my fist. Madison wasn't in the library, or the study, or the solarium, or the gunroom, or the studio, or the home gym, so I went upstairs. I finally found her sitting on the floor of our bathroom with the door closed and the lights off, crying and clutching a Neiman Marcus catalog to her chest. I put on my doting husband voice. "Hey, Madison, I bought your bouquet of flowers," I told her as I held the bundle of plant matter out to her. Madison managed to look up at me. Tears were streaming down her face and streaking her makeup. She hesitated when she saw the bouquet, but she finally took it and sniffed the flowers with understandable apprehension. Something about the scent must have pleased her, because she immediately buried her face into the flowers and began to inhale deeply. After maybe a minute, she lowered the flowers and climbed to her feet. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I need to pull myself together." "Oh, don't worry, my dear," I kept using my doting husband voice as I answered her. Her rapidly improving mood encouraged me so much that I leaned over and gave her the barest peck on her tear-stained cheek. To my surprise, as I came near to her, Madison threw her arms around me. She pressed herself against me there, between the ghastly toilet open to the room and the sinks, her chest heaving as she went from sobbing to something else I didn't quite recognize. Dinner that night was another peculiar goulash, or whatever it was the peasant considered to be food. Madison and I ate together in the dining room as usual, with the hired woman discreetly out of sight. Madison was absolutely chatty, asking me about my day at the factory, telling me about how lovely the grounds around the mansion looked under the dusting of new snow we'd received that afternoon. She even complimented the food, wretched as it was, saying, "My, I must tell Ivolka how delicious this is." I scowled at her. "Who's Ivolka?" I asked. Madison laughed for the first time since we'd arrived in the Ozarks. "Not Ivolva," she giggled. "Ivolka, our cook. She made a delicious dinner tonight, so I should thank her." Madison stood with a flourish. I was confused. "Excuse me, Madison, are you feeling well?" I asked her. "You seem a bit out of sorts this evening, my dear. Perhaps you need to retire early." Madison gave me a smile that I hadn't seen since the south of France. Then she winked at me and said, "I do believe that I'd like to turn in early tonight. Will you meet me in bed in an hour's time?" I stammered. "Certainly. I mean, yes, you need your rest, dear." Madison winked at me again before she walked off toward the kitchen, calling out, "Ivolka, dear, that was a wonderful meal." I left the table quickly and headed to my upstairs office. We ate late, as befits our station, so it wasn't unreasonably early to go to bed. Still, I wanted to review some documents I'd printed off at the office that afternoon. 50 minutes after dinner ended, I was sitting up in bed reading a proposed supplier contract when Madison slinked into the room. "Good evening, sweetie," she purred at me. "Good evening, dear," I responded without looking up. "Give me a few moments and I'll join you," Madison said. "That's fine, dear," I said. I heard Madison rummaging around in the closet and the bathroom, but I paid her little mind. Instead, I was focused on a particularly troublesome clause that would have obliged Montgomery Mechanicals to pay an unacceptably high price for plastic if the supplier's input costs increased. I was jotting my notes in red ink along the margin of the page to discuss on the phone with my attorney the next morning, when Madison suddenly leaned down between me and the contract. "Well, that's surely enough work tonight, baby," she said as she nibbled my earlobe. A tingle of excitement mingled with fear shot through me as I realized she was wearing a negligee from her bridal trousseau. I marked my place on the paper as Madison sauntered around to her side of the bed. I'd barely placed the papers on my nightstand before Madison leapt into the bed and threw a leg across my hips. "Oh, baby," she murmured as she brushed her lips along my neck. "Love those flowers. Thank you for being so considerate." Then she was on me with a passion that I did not recognize, not even from our honeymoon on the Mediterranean. Worried though I was about what was happening to my wife, I did my husbandly duty, both times. After a few surreal weeks, during which Madison was pleasantly happy, and, of all the bizarre things, took up hiking around the grounds of the mansion, I returned at my wife's behest to Granny's Yarbs and Apothecary for another bouquet. The old woman inside was busy mashing something at her table when the bell on the door jangled to announce my rather obvious entrance. Without even looking up, the old crone greeted me. "Well, Mr. Montgomery, I take it your missus liked the flowers real well." My wife liked the bouquet just fine. I always made it a point to use proper English and careful elocution when I spoke with these people. "I have returned to purchase another bouquet for her, if I may." The tiny woman nodded at my words, her eyes still on whatever it was she was doing with her mortar and pestle. "I was figuring as much," she said, "so I've been working up something special for you, and I should have known it. The old crone was going to try to sell me some special bouquet at an unnecessary higher price. Well, the Montgomerys didn't become wealthy by giving in to such tactics. I assure you, madam, that we do not require anything beyond the basic bouquet." The old woman hit me with a stare from those terrible blue eyes. "Don't you worry, Morty," she told me. "I ain't going to charge you any extra for this one. It's still going to be just $5. The second bundle of flowers smelled even more potent than the first. Their stems had been dipped in a pungent salve that smelled so bad that I had to roll down the window of my Jaguar for the drive home. It was a drizzly, cold afternoon in early March. I dreaded getting my car's soft leather upholstery wet, but the penetrating stench of the bundle would have overwhelmed me otherwise. As I drove slowly up our long, meandering driveway, I realized, to my horror, that Madison was marching around outside of the house like some common groundskeeper. She was even carrying a bundle of some sort in her arms. She had a companion with her, and the two women had an air of holiday about them as they took deliberate, long paces along the south lawn of the mansion. Every few strides, Madison would stop, and her companion would take something from the bundle my wife carried. A stake, I saw as I drew up almost to the carriage house, and then her companion would use a hammer to drive the stake into the ground. I nearly crashed my car into one of those damn oak trees when I realized who Madison was pacing about the lawn with. Her new companion was the Salvian peasant woman I'd hired to cook for us. I slammed on the brakes before I even reached the carriage house, and left my precious Jaguar running in the driveway with its windows open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I screamed as I charged across the lawn. The peasant tried to hide behind my wife as I approached. Madison just beamed at me. "Volka and I are laying out a vegetable garden, dear." Madison's voice bubbled like she'd just found a new color of Birkin bag. The sun on this side of the house should be perfect. How are we going to hire a gardener when we can't even find a decent cook? I bellowed. Madison giggled. Don't worry, silly, she said. I can tend to the garden. Then her nose quivered as she sniffled the cold, damp air. Oh, Morty, she squealed. You brought me more flowers. In the days that followed, Madison terrified me with her escalating enthusiasms. As perplexing as her desire for at least nightly congress was, her newfound fondness for both physical labor and the company of the peasant woman made it clear that Madison was losing her mind. Every morning, Madison was out of bed before dawn and digging in our lawn. Usually, the peasant woman was with her, both of them dressed in frumpy jeans that looked like they came from the gas station in town. Madison even took to wearing some kind of rubber gardening clogs instead of the stiletto heels and strappy sandals she used to favor. It was both pathetic and tragic for her, but I increasingly worried that I might not be safe around my dangerously deranged wife. Madison even bought a Rottweiler by mail order along with a tool set. When I came home from work one Tuesday in April, she was using her new tools to assemble the tiller right there in the carriage house. I scowled at her and told her that this sort of work was not very ladylike. She giggled at that, a mirthful sound that sent shivers down my spine. The next morning, she wielded the tiller herself to dig up 24 patches of grass under our bedroom window, waking me up at an ungodly hour. I foolishly hoped it would pass, but Madison kept falling deeper and deeper into her madness. She even began cooking the enormous amounts of produce she was producing in her new garden. I came home on a Friday evening in May, and I had to search the entire mansion before I finally located my wife in the kitchen, using some sort of knife to cut an onion into small pieces. The Selvagian peasant was right beside my poor, sick bride, demonstrating the process with a knife of her own as she gestured and spoke in broken English. What's going on here? I demanded. The cook cowered at my voice in a gratifying way, but Madison spun around at my shout and beamed at me. Oh, she said, Evolka is being a dear and showing me how to dice an onion. Why in the world, I asked, do you want to learn how to douse an onion? Madison giggled at me like a cheap floozy. It's dice, not douse, silly. She sat the knife down on the counter and walked over to me. She placed a lingering kiss on my cheek. And why shouldn't I learn how to cook for you? I snorted. Because you're Madison Montgomery? Because we hire people to cook for me? Madison laughed again, threw her arms around my neck, and kicked a foot back as she looked up at me. It's all well and good to hire help sometimes, she said, but I still want to be able to do for my man. She kissed me on the mouth then, hard, before she pushed me away. Dinner will be ready in about an hour, baby, she told me. You go relax. Then she turned back to Evolka and started to cut up what I think was a carrot, only it had something green and leafy coming out of one end. Despite my dread for the terrible little shop, Madison's powerful insistence and my fear of my altered wife compelled me to keep buying bouquets from that crazy old woman every few weeks. When August began with a terrible heat wave that severely tested my automobile's air conditioning, my purchase from Granny's Yarbs and Apothecary was the weirdest yet. It was just a glass jar full of greenish water with petals of some sort floating above twisty tendrils of chopped roots. The jar and its contents were so repulsive that I was terrified of what Madison's response to receiving it would be. Surely she'd not gone so far as to deem a jar of disgusting glop acceptable. Still, she'd insisted that I obtain another gift from Granny that day, so I feared that Madison and what she would do if I returned home empty-handed. A part of me remembered Madison from the French Riviera, was certain that this terrible jar of foulness would break the spell that horrible woman had put my wife under. Finding Madison to even give her the jar of disgusting water proved to be difficult. I had to search through the entire garden before I found her and the peasant woman, hoeing the ground beneath towering plants that Madison called okra. So deep was Madison's madness, instead of being horrified by the concoction, that was in no way a bouquet, she squealed with delight, opened the lid, and started to drink the contents of the jar in eager gulps. Discretion being the better part of valor, I asked Madison to put the hoe down. She dutifully laid it at her feet as she licked the remaining drops of green-tinted liquid from her lips. Then I took a deep breath and said it just like I'd practiced in my Jaguar driving back to the mansion that afternoon. I absolutely am not buying you any more gifts from that granny person. Are you sure of that, sweetie? She winked at me. I promise to make it worth your while if you keep fetching my gifts from Granny. She winked again. I'm certain of my decision, I said. I don't know how that old witch's vaguely floral monstrosities have made you so deranged, but I hope that you come to your senses again once you cease receiving them. Madison looked at me with indignation. Granny Branson ain't no witch, she shouted. She's a proper granny. Excuse me, a what? I asked. A granny. Granny ain't no devil worshippers like witches are. Granny Branson's mama was a granny, and her mama's mama was a granny before that, and so on, for as long as anyone around here knows. I rubbed my forehead as I tried to process my wife's sudden interest in the genealogies of the local stock. I don't understand, I said, slowly and carefully. What's so special about an old hillbilly woman being a grandmother? I had a grandmother. You still have a grandmother alive. For God's sakes, Madison, your grandmother came to our wedding. Maybe you should go visit her and take a little break from this area. Madison shook her head at that. Absolutely not, Morty. My place is right here, with my husband, to do for you. Besides, it takes a lot more than being a grandmother to be a granny. And why are you talking like one of them now? I demanded. Ah, baby, that just happens natural-like, from being around folks is all. It was mighty lonely, just me and Ivolka here all by ourselves, all day, every day, till we started going into town, some to see Granny Branson. Madison winked at our cook, and I do believe that our Ivolka here's a fixin' to take up with Granny Branson's grandson Bobby that runs the gas station. The peasant woman blushed, then nodded. Wait, you've been going into town by yourself to see this granny person? Not by myself, sweetie. I've been taking Ivolka with me. That's how it was she met Bobby. I took a deep breath to steady my nerves. Madison, I began in the calmest voice I could muster. I absolutely forbid you from going into town to see this granny person anymore. Madison frowned, but then she sort of looked past me and said, Well, you're the man of the house, if that's what you say. I won't be a-going into town to see Granny Branson no more. Then she added, more to the peasant than to me, Good thing Granny Branson gave me all them seeds. By October, I'd made up my mind. It was clear that the beautiful, cultured woman I'd chosen to be my first wife was gone, somehow perverted by something that old crone had done. I couldn't understand it, but I didn't have to live with it. I called my lawyer. Of course, Alan was a corporate attorney, so he didn't want to handle the divorce himself. Fortunately, his firm has an office in St. Louis, and one of his partners there was reputed to be the top divorce attorney in all of Missouri. The Montgomery name and fortune was enough to get that partner, William Quantail, to meet me at the factory the very next day. Of course, it helped that I'd already written him a six-figure retainer and was paying him $5 an hour to drive down the twisty, terrifying roads that spend more time going back and forth and up and down than in a more productive direction. Still, it was gratifying to take charge of the situation. His rates were a small price to pay to extract me from the daily terror of my wife's alteration. William Quantail arrived at my corner office an hour late, wearing an expensive but rumpled suit, carrying a smart leather briefcase, and slurping on a straw from an enormous white styrofoam cup. He burst into my office briskly and unannounced, my 8th secretary apparently having gone missing without my leave, like the rest had before. William immediately apologized for his tardiness. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting, Morty," he said, "but I had a bit of car trouble outside of town." I flinched at the greeting. "I understand that the roads are hard on vehicles around here, Mr. Quantail, but I must ask you to refrain from calling me Morty. It's an unfortunate nickname that my soon ex-to-be wife and one of the locals have taken to calling me, and I don't care for it at all." The lawyer nodded and sat down in a chair across from my desk, without so much as an invitation. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Montgomery. It's just that the boys down at the gas station called you that while they was fixing my car. I was beginning to have doubts about my legal counsel." "Excuse me, Mr. Quantail, what did you say?" "In proper English, please." He took another long draw on his cup before he answered. "Well, I was a-saying..." He stopped himself, took a deep breath, and began again. "The men at the service station repaired my car, and while I waited, they talked about how this newest Montgomery was, as they put it, a-going to be different. They called you Morty instead of Mortimer, so I thought you'd have dropped the moniker." It looked like getting that out in proper English had exhausted him. He took another long drink and sighed. "This here concoction they had at the filling station sure is mighty good. I should have bought you one of them. I'm so sorry that I didn't think to do that. Mr. Quantail, I have no interest whatsoever in the delights of hillbilly gas stations. Please, let's discuss the matter at hand. Based on the prenuptial agreement, we must move quickly with the divorce so that Madison cannot receive any of my fortune." Quantail swirled the styrofoam cup in his hand as he chose his words. "I was expecting a proposal to file whatever paperwork was needed before the end of the week. Instead, he said, 'Morty, I don't reckon you ought to divorce this girl. She sure sounds like a good 'un.' I threw the lawyer out of my office while shouting demands that my retainer be returned in its entirety. Both terror and fury boiled within me. Somehow, the old witch had even changed my divorce attorney, a man who had only been in the blighted town a few hours. I knew that it was only a matter of time before something would be done to me, but I also knew that I couldn't risk violating the terms of the Montgomery Family Trust by fleeing my post. There was only one viable solution, one that had served Montgomerys well for generations. I would have to bully these unimportant people into submission. I worked on my speech as I drove into town and careened to Granny's Yarbs and Apothecary. I summoned up a righteous anger as I stormed inside to find a veritable convention of looniness within the tiny shop. Of course, the woman, apparently known as Granny Branson, was there, calmly rocking in her chair. My damn wife was there, in direct violation of my orders, chopping some sort of stems and leaves on the table. Behind the rocking chair, there stood a giant man with arms as big around as dinner plates. The Slavonian peasant woman was clutching at his biceps and smiling. And there, in the back of the shop, below the possum still hanging in the doorway, stood my now fired divorce attorney. I nearly ripped the front door off of the hinges with my forceful entrance. The bell was still ringing as I began to shout. "I refuse to tolerate this. I don't care what becomes of my future ex-wife, but I'm going to find a lawyer that will help me divorce her, and she's not going to get so much as a slim dime of my money. And then I'll buy every damn square inch of this place and bulldoze it all down." Madison stopped chopping as I ranted and turned to look at me. The peasant cook smiled, and the man she clung to flexed his arms a bit. William Quantail stood stock still beneath the possums, and in the center of it all, the old woman rocked serenely as all eyes went to her. She finally spoke. "I reckon you may have a hankering to do all that, Morty," she began. "And I know this here lawyer man tells me that you's got one of them there premarital agreements that you think will get you off scot-free if you were to divorce this fine lady here?" Madison blushed at the old woman's praise. The crone continued, "Only what I reckon you may not know is that this here lawyer man has taken a look at your last will and testament, and that family trust thing you worry about so much, too. It sure seems like Mattie here will make out real well if something was to happen to you, Morty." My knees began to go weak under me. "You'd never get away with it. I'm a Montgomery." "Boy," the old woman interrupted me with a sharp tone, "are y'all really so stupid as to think that anything that happened to you wouldn't look mighty natural? I don't often use my talent for such things, but when I do, there sure ain't nobody knows." I gulped and turned to run. I figured that if I could just make it to my Jaguar, I could get away. I was certain that my fine automobile could outrun hick pickup trucks the locals drove and get to the comparative safety of St. Louis in a few hours. After a step, though, I stopped. There was a half-dozen large hillbilly men gathered around my car, standing stern and still and very much in my way if I were to flee. Behind me, the old woman chuckled. "I reckon you's beginning to see the wisdom of my plan, ain't you, Morty?" These days, Mattie, as she now insists on being called, is as happy as a pig in mud, or whatever it is these hill people would say. Not long after our little meeting with Granny Branson, Mattie started running a still back behind the mansion. She says she needs the liquor she makes for medicinal purposes, and to judge from the raucous parties in the carriage house, Mattie's medicine is quite popular. Ivolka and her new husband moved into the mansion with us. Bobby drives me to and from work every day in his truck. I had a driver when I worked on Wall Street, but I'd never ridden in a pickup before. Like a lot of things around here, it's taken some getting used to. Speaking of taking some getting used to, Mattie tells me that she is, as she puts it, in the family way. I guess that news shouldn't be any surprise, what with the way she's been every night since this all started. I'm still trying to do my marital duty, but sometimes the stress of it all is too much for me. Last time I couldn't perform in the bedchamber. Mattie put a few drops of her so-called tinctures on my tongue. And before I knew it, I was ready for action again. I shudder at the memory. I'm not eager to stay here, but Mattie insists that she wouldn't dream of bringing up our child anywhere else. Given that Granny Branson and all of her rather sizable kinfolk agree with her, I'm not sure that I have much choice in the matter. At least the factory has internet access. It's one of the few places around here that does. Thanks to that, I've been able to call and email my friends to ask for help, but they've all laughed at me. Some of them even claim that I've gone native, and that I'm just concocting wild stories to justify it. I guess that I don't really expect you to believe me either, but I have to try. Even if I can't leave here, I need someone to believe me when I tell them what I've gone through. I need someone to know why Mortimer Montgomery is stuck in these damn hills.
Chilling tales for dark nights.